Hey there, tonight, we're uncovering the strange rituals of the ancient Assyrians. What you're about to discover might just change how you feel about your own bedtime routine. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy. Maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. You're there, standing amidst the grand ruins of ancient Assyria, where sleep wasn't just a nightly pause but an elaborate ritual. This isn't your average, get your 8 hours and call it a night situation. Nope, in the 7th century BCE, the Assyrians had a full-blown obsession with dreams, and not just the I'm falling and can't stop type. Think of it this way. You're a high-ranking Assyrian, and you've had a dream where a fish tells you to plant barley. In modern terms, you'd probably wake up, shrug it off, and maybe lay off the seafood before bedtime. But back then, you'd be scrambling to find the nearest dream interpreter, because that fish could be the key to your next harvest or impending doom. These folks didn't just dabble in dream analysis. They wrote the book on it, literally. Carved into clay tablets in the library of Ashurbanipal, they documented dreams with a fervor that would put Freud to shame. Let's talk about this library. Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, 668-627 BCE, had this massive library in Nineveh with over 30,000 clay tablets. Imagine a Kindle, but made of mud and about as portable as a boulder. Among these tablets were detailed records of dreams and their interpretations. They weren't just jotting down nocturnal escapades for fun. These dreams influenced everything from military campaigns to whether or not to have that extra piece of goat cheese. Dream interpretation was serious business. The Assyrians believed that dreams were messages from the gods, and decoding them was akin to having a cheat sheet for life. In fact, if you were anyone of importance, you'd have your preferred dream interpreter on speed dial. Well, if speed dial existed in the ancient world, these interpreters were like the rock stars of their time, consulted before any big decision. Launching a war without checking in with your dream guy, that's a rookie mistake that no self-respecting king would make. The clay tablets from Ashurbanipal's library are a gold mine of quirky specifics. One tablet might tell you that dreaming of a lion means you're about to gain power, but only if the lion was friendly. If it wasn't, well, start prepping your will. Another tablet could inform you that dreaming of a snake means a powerful enemy is coming your way. It's like having your own personal fortune cookie factory, except each cookie has the potential to alter your destiny. But before we romanticize Assyrian dream interpretation as some mystical art, let's hit pause. While it sounds exotic, it was also deeply pragmatic. These interpretations were a way to make sense of a chaotic world. In an era where the next drought, flood, or invasion could be lurking around the corner, any edge, imagined or otherwise, was worth its weight in lapis lazuli. So, you might be wondering, did these dream interpretations actually work? Did they provide some magical insight that helped the Assyrians conquer empires and build impressive ziggurats? Well, let's just say they had their hits and misses. Sure, there were times when a dream interpreter might predict a bountiful harvest or advise a king to delay an attack, leading to success. Other times, they might have been way off the mark, but hey, nobody's perfect. The importance placed on dreams even extended to commoners, albeit in a less formal capacity. A farmer wouldn't commission a tablet for every odd dream, but the local gossip mill would certainly churn with tales of prophetic dreams and their supposed outcomes. This societal obsession with dreams created a shared cultural touchstone, a way for people to connect and make sense of their collective experiences. And here's where we debunk a little myth. While it might be tempting to view the Assyrians as living in a constant state of prophetic clarity, the reality was more nuanced. Dream interpretation was as much about reinforcing the status quo and consolidating power as it was about divining the future. A favorable interpretation for the king's dream could mean the difference between peace and rebellion, prosperity and ruin. In some ways, these dreams were less about the gods whispering secrets and more about the interpreters shaping narratives to fit political needs. So next time you drift off into slumber and dream of something bizarre, remember that you're in good company. The ancient Assyrians were right there with you, trying to decode the messages of the night, balancing between divine whispers and human interpretation. In their world, every dream mattered, and every interpretation could shift the course of history. Whether it was deciphering a message from the guards or simply finding a way to justify the latest royal whim, dreams were the currency of the unseen, guiding decisions and shaping destinies. In the grand tapestry of ancient Assyrian society, dreams were less about pillow talk and more about political leverage. When Sennacherib, that charmingly ruthless king who reigned from 705 to 681 BCE, settled into his royal bedchamber, he wasn't just hoping for a good night's sleep. He was waiting for his next political power play to unfold in the realm of dreams. Imagine waking up with a divine endorsement in your back pocket, ready to sway your court and intimidate your enemies. Sennacherib knew that a well-timed dream was more potent than 1,000 chariots. For the Assyrians, dreams weren't just fluffy cognitive recalibrations. They were cosmic communiques, and kings like Sennacherib wielded them like a masterful puppeteer. When Sennacherib dreamt of the gods granting him favor, it wasn't just a personal boost, it was a political weapon. You see, in a world where divine favor was the ultimate seal of approval, dreams provided an unassailable mandate from the heavens. If you were an Assyrian king and claimed that Marduk or Asher had whispered sweet reassurances into your ear while you slept, well, who could argue? Not the trembling subjects, that's for sure. But here's the thing, dreams were more than just ethereal propaganda. They were expensive business. Think of it as running a high-stakes political campaign, complete with all the costs. Professional dream interpreters, the secular prophets of their day, didn't come cheap. These were the consultants you hired not just for your dreams, but for your future. If you were a king, their fees were part of the imperial budget, a necessary expense to keep the empire's gears greased. If you were a commoner, well, you'd better start saving those shekels, or hope your dreams were self-explanatory. Let's talk numbers for a moment. The cost of a professional interpreter could vary, but in an economy where a skilled laborer might earn a shekel or two a month, you could expect to fork over a decent chunk of change for a top-tier dream analyst. These interpreters were the aristocrats of the intellectual realm, their insights a commodity as prized as gold or grain. The economic implications were significant, influencing everything from individual fortunes to the flow of goods across the empire. The money spent on dream interpretation filtered through markets and households, creating an entire microeconomy based on the analysis of the unconscious mind. In terms of raw power, Sennacherib had it all figured out. When his armies besieged Jerusalem in 701 BCE, the psychological warfare extended beyond the battlefield. Sennacherib claimed that a dream had assured him of victory, using it as a divine PR campaign. It was less about the actual dream and more about how it was spun. The king was the original spin doctor, weaving dreams into narratives that bolstered his legitimacy and cowed his adversaries. Who needs truth when you have a dream interpreter on retainer? But let's not romanticize this as some mystical art form. The stark reality was that dreams served as a political safety net. If a king's policy led to disaster, a conveniently timed dream could provide a divine scapegoat or a new direction. It was a classic case of the gods made me do it. While the notion of divine intervention adds a layer of grandeur, it's worth remembering that these interpretations often reinforced existing hierarchies and power structures. Dreams were as much about control as they were about prophecy, a means to solidify the king's rule and keep the populace in check. Economically, this reliance on dreams revealed a society deeply invested in the unseen. It also meant that the profession of dream interpretation was highly competitive. If you were an interpreter, your reputation was everything. A few bad calls, and you might find yourself out of favor and out of work. The stakes were high, and the pressure was on to deliver interpretations that not only fit the narrative, but also ensured your continued patronage. In a way, the Assyrians' investment in dreams highlights a universal human truth, the desire for certainty in an uncertain world. Romantic appeal of dreams lies in their promise to unveil hidden truths and offer guidance. Yet, the harsh reality was that these nocturnal messages were as much a reflection of human ambition and manipulation as they were of divine will. Dreams, in all their enigmatic glory, were a tool, a powerful one, but a tool nonetheless, shaped by human hands to serve very human ends. As we unravel the threads of Assyrian dreams, we witness the interplay of economy, politics, and belief, an intricate dance where dreams were both currency and weapon, where kings like Sennacherib wielded them with cunning precision. And while the empire may have crumbled, the allure of dreams endures, a testament to their enduring power to captivate and control. So next time you lay your head down to sleep, remember, in the dreams of old, whole empires rose and fell, guided by the whispers of gods and the interpretations of men. And so, as you drift into the dream-laden world of ancient Assyria, let's pull back the silken veil and peek into the bedtime routines of the folks back then. Spoiler alert, they didn't just fluff their pillows and call it a night. Nope, these night owls were the original sleep hackers, transforming their boudoirs into dream sanctuaries that put modern sleep apps to shame. Forget about counting sheep. These people were counting on everything from incense to intricate bedroom feng shui to woo the gods of slumber. First up, let's talk about the perfume of the night. No, I'm not referring to a fancy cologne, but to the heavy, aromatic clouds of incense wafting through the air. Assyrians believed that certain scents could act as a direct line to the divine, a kind of celestial heartline that ensured your dreams were on the gods' radar. Frankincense and myrrh were popular choices, and before you roll your eyes, remember that these substances were the ancient world's answer to an intercessory telegram. Only, instead of sending a polite memo, you were filling your chambers with an olfactory plea for good fortune. And if you think your favorite artisanal candle is pricey, try this on for size. Frankincense was worth its weight in gold, literally. In the bustling trade cities of Mesopotamia, a pound of the stuff could set you back more than a month's wages for a skilled worker. But fragrance alone wasn't enough. The Assyrians were masters of multitasking, and their nocturnal prep went far beyond just setting the mood. Enter the bedroom arrangements that would make a modern interior designer swoon. The positioning of the bed was crucial, often facing east to greet the rising sun's first rays, symbols of rebirth and divine favor. Think of it as an ancient form of solar therapy, minus the hefty spa bill. And let's not overlook the intricate rituals involving symbolic objects placed just so around the sleeping quarters. Statues of protective deities, amulets, and even sacred texts were strategically positioned to ward off bad dreams and invite the good ones. You could say their bedrooms were the original safe spaces, fortified with spiritual security systems. Now, you might wonder, did all this effort really pay off? Were Assyrians basking in divine dreams every night, or was it all just smoke and mirrors? Quite literally. The truth is, while these rituals were deeply rooted in cultural beliefs, they didn't always guarantee a direct line to the gods. Much like modern sleep aids, the effects were hit or miss. But here's the kicker. The rituals themselves were as much about psychological comfort as they were about divine communication. There's a certain peace in knowing you've done everything possible to stack the odds in your favor, even if it meant a nightly ritual that rivaled a Broadway production. And while we're on the subject of myth-busting, let's untangle the romanticized tales of dream encounters with gods. Sure, it sounds enchanting to think of Marduk popping by for a midnight chat, but the reality was less divine intervention and more human invention. The tales of divine dream encounters were often woven into the historical narrative to legitimize a ruler's divine right to rule. If you were a king, claiming that Asher had paid you a visit was a convenient way to silence dissent and rally support. After all, who could argue with the gods? But let's not kid ourselves. These stories, as embellished as they might be, served an essential purpose. They were the ancient version of a PR campaign, a divine endorsement that bolstered political power. And while they might stretch the truth a tad, they also reflect a universal human desire for approval from forces greater than ourselves. It's the age-old quest for validation, wrapped in a cloak of incense and whispered promises. Now, let's not forget the gritty side of Assyrian sleep hygiene, a less glamorous but equally fascinating aspect of this nocturnal narrative. You see, while the elite could afford dream-inducing rituals and luxurious beds, the common folk were left dealing with the practicalities of ancient living. Forget memory foam mattresses. Most people were sleeping on straw mats or simple wooden frames. And let's not even get started on the pests. Bedbugs were an ancient nuisance, more tenacious than a door-to-door salesman, turning the quest for restful sleep into a nightly battle. In terms of cleanliness, ancient Assyrians were surprisingly ahead of their time. They understood the importance of separating sleeping areas from cooking and bathing spaces, a practice that speaks to a keen awareness of sanitation. While not every home could boast a separate bedroom, those who could afford it recognized the health benefits of a designated sleep zone. It's a testament to their pragmatic approach to life. Even in an era of divine dreams, they knew better than to ignore the basics of good hygiene. In the end, the Assyrian bedtime rituals were a blend of superstition, science, and psychology. They reveal a culture striving to control the uncontrollable, to find certainty in the chaos of life. It's a theme that resonates even today as we search for ways to make sense of the world and our place within it. While the specifics may have changed, trade incense for essential oils, clay tablets for digital apps, the underlying human desire for assurance and guidance remains as potent as ever. So, as we drift through the nighttime practices of ancient Assyria, remember that these rituals were more than just quirky customs. They were a reflection of a society deeply invested in the power of dreams, where the boundaries between the tangible and the divine were as fluid as the Euphrates. Whether through the fragrant tendrils of incense or the careful placement of a bed, the Assyrians sought to bridge the gap between the earthly and the ethereal, all in the hopes of securing a better tomorrow. And while they might not have had all the answers, their pursuit of understanding offers a timeless lesson in the art of dreaming, a lesson that, much like the dreams themselves, transcends time and space. So, while the Assyrians were busy perfecting their dream rituals with incense and celestial bed alignments, another layer of intrigue was unfolding in the realm of myths. Assyrian society wasn't just about dream interpretation for personal enlightenment or divine favor. It was also about keeping everyone in line. Enter the myth of the Dream King, a tale spun with enough drama to make a soap opera look like a documentary. Now, let's get one thing straight. The Dream King wasn't an actual monarch parading around in his pajamas, but rather a symbolic figure representing the ideal dreamer, someone whose nocturnal visions were believed to be especially prophetic and therefore crucial for the community's well-being. Think of him as the ancient Assyrian version of a social media influencer, only instead of hashtags, he had dream symbols that could sway public opinion or bolster a king's legitimacy. The concept of the Dream King cleverly served to maintain social order. By elevating certain dreams as divinely inspired, Assyrian leaders could craft narratives that reinforced the status quo. Need to quell a rebellion? Conveniently, the Dream King dreamt of the gods favoring the current regime. Want to justify a new tax? The Dream King saw it in a vision as a sacred duty to ensure prosperity. It was an ancient version of "because I said so," but with a divine twist. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Not everyone who dreamt of divine messages ended up in the Dream King Hall of Fame. In fact, having the wrong kind of dream could land you in hot water. Let's say you were a commoner who dreamt that the gods favored a new leader. A dream like that could quickly turn you into an outcast. In Assyria, your dreams didn't just stay in your head. They had real-world consequences, spelling the difference between celebrity and scorn. And speaking of scorn, let's talk about the societal pressure cooker that turned dreamers into either stars or pariahs. There was an intense fascination with those who claimed to have prophetic visions, but this double-edged sword could cut deep. On one hand, you could become the toast of Nineveh, with nobles and merchants vying for your insights like medieval paparazzi. On the other hand, one misinterpreted dream, and you'd find yourself shunned faster than a bad penny. Take, for example, the notorious case of a dream interpreter who gained notoriety by predicting the downfall of a particular official. When that official was later caught embezzling temple funds, the interpreter's stark soared. But when his next prediction, that a drought would plague the region, failed to materialize, he was quickly discredited and run out of town. The lesson: dream interpretation was a high-stakes game, and the house rarely lost. The economic implications of all this were as tangled as a Babylonian knot. The demand for dream interpreters surged, creating a bustling market for their services. And while the elite could afford to employ these dream consultants full-time, ordinary folks often had to resort to more creative means, like pooling resources to hire an interpreter for the entire village. It's a bit like sharing a Netflix subscription, but with much higher stakes. In terms of numbers, Hiring a well-regarded interpreter might set you back several shekels, a significant sum in a world where the average laborer took home barely 1 or 2 shekels a month. This created a social divide, where the wealthy could afford the luxury of divine insight, while the less fortunate had to rely on communal interpretations or, worse, their own wits. In the game of dreams, the rich had a head start, while the poor were often left to fend for themselves in the murky waters of symbolism. But let's burst another bubble while we're at it. The romantic idea that every dream provided a clear roadmap to success is about as realistic as finding a unicorn in your backyard. Sure, some dreams might have inspired great deeds or warned of impending doom, but plenty of others led to wild goose chases or outright disaster. The annals of Assyrian history are littered with tales of misguided dreams that promised riches only to deliver ruin. Consider King Ashurbanipal's lesser-known cousin, a minor noble who dreamt of discovering a hidden treasure. Convinced of its divine origin, he squandered his estate financing expeditions to unearth this imagined hoard. Spoiler alert, he found nothing but empty coffers and a tarnished reputation. And while his dream of gold turned to dust, his story serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of taking dreams too literally. Yet, despite these missteps, the allure of dreams persisted. They offered a glimpse into the unknown, a tantalizing promise that the gods might favor you with hidden knowledge. For the Assyrians, dreams were a bridge between the mundane and the divine, a nightly sojourn into a realm where anything was possible, even if reality often begged to differ. So, as we unravel the myths and realities of Assyrian dreams, we're left to ponder the eternal human quest to find meaning in the seemingly arbitrary. Whether through the lens of a dream king or the everyday person dreaming of a better life, the ancient Assyrians remind us that dreams have always been more than mere figments of the imagination. They are reflections of our deepest desires and fears, shaped by the hands of those who interpret them and the society that clings to them for guidance. And as we continue our journey through the dream-laden halls of ancient Assyria, remember this. While dreams may be as ephemeral as the smoke from an incense burner, their impact on the waking world can be as lasting as the carvings on a clay tablet. So the next time you find yourself wandering through the labyrinth of your own dreams, take solace in knowing that you're following in the footsteps of civilization that, despite its ancient origins, grappled with the same mysteries of the night that we do today. And who knows, perhaps your dreams, like theirs, hold the power to shape the world around you, if only you can decipher their secrets. As we wander back to the present, it's time to draw some lines, or maybe dream trails, from ancient Assyrian rituals to our modern sleep obsessions. Because, let's face it, humanity's quest for the perfect night's sleep is as timeless as bedhead. Just as the Assyrians believed that dreams held the keys to their fate, today's world is teeming with a similar fixation. Only now it's wrapped in the sleek packaging of sleep apps, weighted blankets, and bedtime podcasts that promise to lull us into dreamland. Now, before we get too starry-eyed about our digital lullabies, let's take a hard look at the numbers. The global sleep aids market is projected to hit a staggering $101, $9 billion by 2023. Compare that to the ancient Assyrian economy, where a pound of frankincense, prized for its dream-inducing properties, might cost more than a month's wages for a skilled laborer. In a society where dreams were a premium product, the economic impact was real, even if it was wrapped in the haze of divine mystery. And speaking of mystery, let's not ignore the parallel of dream interpretation, an art that has undergone its own metamorphosis. The clay tablets of yore have been replaced by sleek dream analysis apps, promising to decode the symbolism of our subconscious for a small monthly fee. It's a comforting notion that we can somehow quantify the unquantifiable, though the odds of finding a hidden treasure map in your dreams are about as likely as winning the lottery. Yet, for all our technological advancements, the allure of dreams remains unchanged. The Assyrians may have consulted their interpreters for guidance, but today we have sleep scientists who study REM cycles with the same reverence. The average adult spends about 25% of their sleep in the REM phase, the stage most associated with vivid dreaming. It's as if we're still chasing the same elusive insights, hoping to glean some cosmic truth before the alarm shatters our ethereal journey. And what about the cultural capital of dreams? Just as the Assyrians crafted narratives around their dream kings, We have our modern dream influencers, figures who sway public opinion and drive trends with their visionary ideas. Whether it's through Hollywood blockbusters or Silicon Valley startups, the power of a dream has never been more lucrative. It's a reminder that, while the medium may have evolved, the message remains the same. Dreams are a currency, traded in the marketplace of human imagination. But let's not romanticize this too much. The harsh reality is that dreams, both ancient and modern, often tell us more about our desires than our destinies. In Assyria, a dream could justify a war or cement a ruler's divine right, but it could just as easily be a tool for control. Fast forward to today, and you'll find that sleep deprivation, a modern-day scourge, affects a third of the global population, blurring the line between dreams and waking life in ways the Assyrians could never have imagined. Yet, even in the midst of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled days, the quest for meaningful dreams persists. It's as if we're all engaged in a collective ritual, searching for those elusive symbols that promise to unlock the mysteries of our lives. And maybe, in some small way, we find solace in the idea that our dreams connect us to something greater, a shared human experience that transcends time and culture. So, as you lay your head on your pillow tonight, think of the Assyrians with their incense-filled chambers and celestial bed positions. Consider the parallels between their world and ours, and how little has truly changed. The rituals may differ, but the yearning for understanding remains the same, a testament to our unending pursuit of knowledge, even in the quietest moments. And as you drift into slumber, perhaps consider this. In a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable, dreams offer a rare glimpse into the unknown, a chance to explore the boundaries of our imagination. Whether they come with divine mandates or simply the promise of a better tomorrow, dreams are a reminder that, even in our most vulnerable state, we are never alone in our search for meaning. It's a legacy that endures, from the clay tablets of Ashurbanipal's library to the digital screens of our smartphones. And while the specifics may have changed, frankincense traded for melatonin, dream interpreters for sleep coaches, the fundamental human desire to find order in the chaos remains as potent as ever. So, as you close your eyes tonight, take comfort in the knowledge that you're part of a long tradition, stretching back to the ancient Assyrians and beyond, in the eternal dance between reality and the realm of dreams. When it comes to making lemonade out of lemons, the Assyrians were the ancient world's master mixologists. Settled in a region that was more grit than glamour, they turned the land between the Tigris and Euphrates into a cockpit of power and military innovation. This was no easy feat, given that their neighbors were as friendly as a nest of vipers. Yet, the Assyrians had a knack for using what they had to flip the script on the ancient geopolitical stage. The Assyrians were smack dab in the middle of what we now call northern Iraq, and let's just say, it wasn't exactly beachfront property. Picture a place with sizzling summers that could make a camel sweat, and winters that didn't quite promise a white Christmas. But nestled in this less-than-idyllic setting were resources that would turn the Assyrian Empire into a military juggernaut. The real game-changer, iron. Before the Assyrians got their hands on it, iron was like the elusive truffle of the ancient world, rare, expensive, and mostly out of reach. While others were still clanking around with bronze, the Assyrians were busy digging up iron deposits and smelting them into weapons that wouldn't shatter on impact. By the 9th century BCE, they'd transformed their armies into a well-oiled machine, armed to the teeth with iron that was as deadly as it was durable. Now, one of the fascinating things about the Assyrians is how they made geography work for them. The Tigris and Euphrates weren't just pretty rivers to gaze at while pondering life's mysteries. These natural highways were the trade routes of their day, and the Assyrians knew that controlling them was as good as having a monopoly on the ancient Silk Road. They harnessed these waterways to move troops and supplies faster than a chariot on a caffeine rush. This logistical savvy meant that when trouble brewed on the horizon, they could be there in a flash, much to the dismay of anyone foolish enough to challenge them. Let's not forget their strategic positioning. The Assyrian heartland was surrounded by mountain ranges and deserts that acted as natural barriers against invasions. It's like having a built-in security system that made any foreign army think twice before crossing. But while these features kept enemies out, they also kept the Assyrians on their toes. They couldn't just sit back and enjoy the view. They had to be constantly vigilant and ready to defend their territory. And here's where the Assyrians really put the art in martial. They knew that an army marches on its stomach and its paycheck. The empire's rulers weren't just about brute force. They understood the economics of warfare. By controlling trade routes and taxing goods that moved through their lands, they ensured that their coffers were as full as their enemies were empty. This wealth allowed them to fund campaigns, pay their soldiers, and importantly, develop new military technologies that kept them ahead of the curve. But let's not get too carried away with the romantic notion of the Assyrian war machine. Sure, they were innovators, but their methods were as ruthless as they were effective. The Assyrians didn't just fight wars. They waged psychological operations. They understood that fear was a powerful weapon, and they wielded it with terrifying efficiency. Their conquest was often accompanied by a reputation for brutality that would make a horror movie look like a bedtime story. But hey, when you're trying to build an empire, sometimes you have to break a few bones. In the grand tapestry of history, the Assyrians are often remembered as the villains of the ancient Near East. Yet, their story is more than just a tale of conquest and carnage. It's a testament to how adversity can breed innovation, and how the right mix of geography, resources, and sheer determination can turn a backwater region into the epicenter of military might. So, the next time you hear about the Assyrians, remember that their empire wasn't just built on blood and iron. It was forged by a people who knew how to play the hand they were dealt, and play it well. And speaking of playing their hand well, let's not forget the Assyrians' penchant for military innovation. These folks were like the Steve Jobs of ancient warfare, always looking for the next big thing to revolutionize the battlefield. While their neighbors were busy trying to reinvent the wheel, literally, the Assyrians were perfecting the art of war with groundbreaking tactics and technologies that would make even the most hardened warrior raise an eyebrow. First up, let's talk about iron weaponry. The Assyrians didn't just dabble in iron, they practically bathed in it. Before iron became the Starbucks of metals, ubiquitous and slightly overpriced, these guys were already cranking out iron swords, spears, and armor that could take a hit and keep on ticking. And iron wasn't just about being tough, it was about being smart. It was cheaper and more abundant than bronze, meaning the Assyrians could arm more soldiers without breaking the empire's piggy bank. By the time the 8th century BCE rolled around, the Assyrian army was a juggernaut of ironclad efficiency, a fact that neighboring kingdoms found about as comforting as a tax audit. But wait, there's more. The Assyrians weren't content with just sharper swords. They wanted better ways to deliver them. Enter the chariot, the ancient equivalent of a sports car with a little more horsepower, literally. While chariots had been around for centuries, the Assyrians gave them a serious upgrade. They introduced a 4-horse chariot model, which was faster and more stable than the older 2-horse versions, effectively turning their charioteers into the Formula One drivers of the ancient world. This meant that their armies could not only strike hard, but also strike fast, an advantage that left their enemies eating dust and licking their wounds. Then there were the siege tactics. If the Assyrians had a calling card, it was their ability to lay siege like nobody's business. They were the original masters of shock and awe, and their methods were as inventive as they were intimidating. We're talking about battering rams that could take down city walls like a wrecking ball through a sandcastle. These weren't your garden variety logs on wheels. They were sophisticated machines, complete with iron tips and protective coverings. The Assyrians also employed siege towers, mobile fortresses that allowed their archers to rain arrows down on defenders from above. It was like bringing a skyscraper to a knife fight. And let's not forget the sappers. These guys were the unsung heroes who dug tunnels under enemy walls, destabilizing them from below. It was a risky job, but when it worked, it was like pulling the rug out from under a city and watching it crumble. The Assyrians' ability to adapt and innovate meant that no city was impregnable, and no enemy could rest easy once the Assyrian war machine was on the move. Now, all this innovation didn't come cheap. Arming an army with iron weapons, building chariots, and constructing siege engines required a hefty budget, not to mention a workforce to build it all. But the Assyrians had that covered too. Their empire's economic engine was fueled by the spoils of war, tribute from conquered territories, and control of lucrative trade routes. It was a win-win situation for them. Conquer more, earn more, build more, repeat. This cycle of conquest and innovation kept the Assyrian war machine well-oiled, and ready to roll over any opposition. Of course, all this military prowess didn't exactly win the Assyrians any popularity contests. Their neighbors viewed them with a mix of awe and fear, mostly fear. But the Assyrians understood that reputation was half the battle. Their ruthless efficiency and innovative strategies made them the ancient world's boogeyman, and that was just fine by them. After all, when you can't be loved, being feared is the next best thing. In the grand scheme of things, the Assyrians were a force to be reckoned with, not just because of their military might, but because of their relentless pursuit of innovation. They weren't content to rest on their laurels. They were always looking for the next advancement, the next edge that would keep them ahead of the pack. And while their methods might have been as brutal as they were brilliant, there's no denying the impact they had on the art of war and the course of history itself. And speaking of relentless pursuits, the Assyrian military machine wasn't just about brute force and iron weapons. It was a well-organized symphony of discipline and propaganda, conducted with precision that would make even a Swiss watch blush. Imagine an ancient army not just marching in step, but practically pirouetting across battlefields, because discipline was the name of the game for the Assyrians. Their troops were drilled like clockwork. We're talking about soldiers who could probably march blindfolded through a sandstorm and still keep formation. This wasn't just about looking good in front of the boss. It was a necessity when your empire stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. Now, you might be wondering how they pulled off such military choreography. The answer lies in an infrastructure that was as impressive as it was expansive. The Assyrians built roads that would make any modern urban planner nod in approval, and maybe a bit of envy. These weren't your run-of-the-mill dirt paths. They were carefully constructed routes that crisscrossed the empire, ensuring that messages and troops could move faster than a rumor at a family reunion. The Royal Road, for instance, stretched over 500 miles, and was so well maintained that you could probably traverse it without losing a sandal. But roads were just the beginning. The Assyrians understood the power of communication long before emails and instant messaging were a twinkle in humanity's eye. They developed an intricate network of signal stations and couriers that could relay information with the speed and efficiency of, well, an ancient postal service on an espresso binge. And let's not forget those iconic clay tablets. Think of them as the Assyrian version of press releases, with scribes churning out reports faster than you can say cuneiform. These tablets were sent out to announce victories, spread propaganda, and occasionally remind neighboring states who was boss. Here's where the myth and the reality start to tango. While the romantic notion might be that the Assyrians were a well-oiled machine running on discipline and efficiency, the truth is that their system was also riddled with the kind of bureaucratic absurdities that would make a DMV visit seem like a walk in the park. Imagine having to send a clay tablet through a network of couriers, only for it to get lost because someone forgot to account for a pesky river in the way. Or a message arriving just in time to be entirely irrelevant, like showing up to a party after everyone's already left. But let's give credit where it's due. The Assyrians were masters of propaganda. They knew that winning hearts and minds was just as important as winning battles. Their kings, like Ashurbanipal and Sennacherib, weren't just warlords. They were the CEOs of a sprawling enterprise that needed to sell its narrative to both its subjects and its enemies. And sell they did, with a flair for the dramatic that would make Shakespeare tip his quill in admiration. They didn't just claim victories. They celebrated them with elaborate reliefs, sculptures, and inscriptions that depicted their kings as larger-than-life figures, often shown trampling enemies underfoot like a particularly aggressive game of Twister. Of course, these depictions were about as unbiased as a politician's campaign ad. They conveniently left out the logistical nightmares, the occasional defeats, and the fact that maintaining such a vast empire was like juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle. But hey, when you're trying to maintain control over a diverse and sprawling population, a little exaggeration goes a long way. Economically speaking, the Assyrian war machine was a beast that needed constant feeding. The coffers might have been filled to the brim with the spoils of conquest, but keeping an army in top shape wasn't cheap. Tribute from conquered lands was a crucial income stream, but it was also a double-edged sword. It kept the empire running, but also meant that any sign of weakness could lead to rebellion, like trying to keep a house of cards steady in a windstorm. Yet, for all their might and cunning, the Assyrians were walking a tightrope. Their reliance on a complex system of roads, communication, and propaganda meant that any disruption could spell disaster. Imagine the chaos if a crucial road was washed away by a flood, or if a courier decided to take a detour for a quick pint at the local tavern. Their system might have been innovative, but it was also fragile, and maintaining it required constant vigilance. In the end, the Assyrian military machine wasn't just about iron and chariots. It was a testament to the power of organization, discipline, and a well-spun narrative. It showed that in the game of empire building, it wasn't enough to have the biggest sword. You also needed the sharpest pen and the swiftest foot. And while their story is often one of conquest and brutality, it's also a reminder of the intricate dance between power and perception, a dance that shaped not just the Assyrians, but the very course of history itself. And speaking of the intricate dance between power and perception, let's waltz into the world of the Assyrian economy, where keeping the empire's war machine humming was less about swords and more about silver. You see, the Assyrians might have been the ancient world's boogeymen, but even the most terrifying empire needs accountants, and plenty of them. Now, before you start picturing ancient CPAs with chisels, let's get one thing straight. Assyrian warfare wasn't just funded by sheer might or plunder, but by a sophisticated system of taxation and tribute that would make even the IRS raise a skeptical eyebrow. The empire's rulers had figured out that if you wanted to keep your empire from imploding faster than a souffle in an earthquake, you needed a reliable income stream. And what better way to do that than by taxing the very lands you conquered? Enter the Assyrian taxation system, the not-so-secret source behind their military might. This wasn't some half-baked affair. It was a full-on buffet of levies, tariffs, and duties that kept the empire's coffers brimming. Picture this. Every conquered territory was expected to pay tribute. Goods, gold, livestock, you name it. It was like a constant bake sale, but instead of cookies, you were handing over your crop yields or silver ingots. And if you couldn't pay up, well, let's just say the Assyrians had a way of making you reconsider your financial priorities. But here's the kicker. The Assyrians weren't just about squeezing their subjects dry. They understood the delicate balance between taxation and rebellion, a tightrope act that required the finesse of a tightrope walker with vertigo. Too much pressure, and you'd have a revolt on your hands. Too little, and you'd risk an empty treasury. To navigate this conundrum, they employed a network of local governors and officials who acted as the empire's eyes and ears, ensuring that tribute flowed steadily without rocking the boat too much. And here's where the Assyrian administrative prowess really shone. These weren't just tax collectors. They were political jugglers, constantly negotiating with local elites to keep the system running smoothly. Imagine the political maneuvering involved in convincing a local chieftain that handing over half his harvest was in his best interest. It was a masterclass in diplomacy, albeit one backed by the not-so-subtle threat of a military visit if things went south. Now, let's pause for a moment to debunk a common myth, the romanticized idea of empire building as a straightforward march of soldiers and banners. In reality, keeping an empire like Assyria together was like herding cats, except each cat had its own agenda and a tendency to sharpen its claws at the slightest provocation. The political landscape was a minefield, with each province a potential tinderbox waiting for a spark. The Assyrian kings, ever the savvy rulers, knew this all too well. They employed a carrot and stick approach, where loyalty was rewarded with protection and prestige, while dissent was met with the kind of corrective measures that would make a horror movie look like a rom-com. It was a delicate dance of power, where every move had to be calculated with the precision of a chess grandmaster, and the stakes were the survival of the empire itself. Take the reign of Tiglath-Pileser Roman III, who ruled from 745 to 727 BCE. This guy was like the Steve Jobs of empire management, constantly innovating and streamlining the administrative machinery. He reorganized the provinces, appointed loyal governors, and even created a standing army that answered directly to the throne. It was a bold move, one that centralized power and ensured that the empire could respond to threats faster than you could say insubordination. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the Assyrian administrative genius. For all their brilliance, the system was also a labyrinth of bureaucracy that could rival any modern-day government in convoluted processes. Imagine trying to navigate a tax code that was as clear as mud, with officials who were as likely to accept bribes as they were to enforce the law. It was a world where paperwork could make or break a province, and where the whims of a local governor could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. Economically, the Assyrian Empire was a colossal balancing act. The spoils of war were all well and good, but they were a short-term fix for a long-term problem. The real challenge lay in maintaining a stable flow of income that could support an army, build infrastructure, and keep the empire ticking. It was a bit like trying to keep a leaky ship afloat, patching holes as fast as they appeared, all while praying you didn't hit an iceberg. And here's where the Assyrians' mastery of logistics came into play. They didn't just rely on taxes and tribute. They tapped into the rich trade networks that crisscrossed their empire. By controlling key trade routes, they ensured that goods flowed smoothly, bringing in revenue that was as vital as the very breath they took. It was a strategy that kept the economic heart of the empire beating, even as the political winds shifted and turned. But the reality was that empire building came with a price tag that could make even the most optimistic ruler break out in a cold sweat. The constant need for military campaigns, the upkeep of infrastructure, the demands of a sprawling bureaucracy, it all added up to a financial burden that could sink lesser empires. The Assyrians managed it with a combination of ruthless efficiency and shrewd political maneuvering, but even they couldn't escape the harsh truths of economic strain. In the end, the Assyrian Empire was a testament to the power of economic and political ingenuity. They were masters of their domain, but their success was built on a foundation that required constant vigilance and adaptation. It was a world where the line between prosperity and collapse was razor-thin, and where the cost of empire was counted not just in gold, but in the blood, sweat, and tears of those who maintained it. So, the next time you hear about the Assyrian war machine, remember that it was as much about ledgers and logistics as it was about legions and lances. It was a story of empire building stripped of its romantic veneer, revealing the gritty reality beneath, a reality where power was both a privilege and a peril, and where the true test of an empire lay not just in its conquests, but in its capacity to endure. And speaking of tests of endurance, let's dive into the legacy of the Assyrian military machine, a legacy that echoes through the annals of history like a particularly catchy tune you just can't shake. The Assyrians were the rock stars of military innovation, and their methods left a lasting impression on civilizations from Rome to modern-day strategists who still crib notes from their playbook. First up, let's talk about their ironclad contributions. The Assyrians weren't just waving swords around, they were pioneering mass production of iron weaponry. By the time they were done, the Bronze Age was on life support, and iron was the new black. This wasn't just about having shiny new toys. It was about creating an army that was as lethal as it was large. Fast forward to Rome, and you'll find the echoes of Assyrian metallurgy in the Roman legions that took iron to new heights, not just in weaponry, but in armor that turned soldiers into walking tanks. And then there was the art of siege warfare. The Assyrians were the original homewreckers, laying siege to cities with battering rams and siege towers that were the ancient equivalent of bringing a bulldozer to a pillow fight. This was more than just brute force. It was about strategy, precision, and a bit of psychological warfare for good measure. By the time the Romans came on the scene, they'd refined these techniques to such an extent that their sieges were less about brawn and more about brain, using engineering to outwit and outlast their enemies, skills that would echo down to the medieval period and beyond. But let's not forget logistics, the unsung hero of the Assyrian war machine. Their road networks and communication systems were the veins and arteries of an empire that needed to move troops and information with the efficiency of a high-speed rail. This was the original express lane, and it set the standard for military logistics that would be emulated by empires for centuries. The Romans picked up this baton and ran with it, building roads that crisscrossed Europe and allowed legions to march with the reliability of a German train schedule, at least when they weren't being ambushed by disgruntled Gauls. Now, on the political stage, the Assyrians were masters of the carrot and stick approach, a technique that would become a staple of diplomatic playbooks around the world. They knew that empire building wasn't just about conquest. It was about control, about keeping the gears of administration turning smoothly while keeping one hand firmly on the sword. Fast forward to the British Empire, and you'll see similar strategies in play as they navigated the complexities of ruling a dominion where the sun famously never set. Of course, the Assyrian legacy isn't all sunshine and rainbows, more like a thunderstorm with occasional lightning strikes. Their reputation for brutality was as legendary as their military prowess, and it's a reputation that stuck. The Romans might have taken notes on efficiency, but they also paid attention to the psychological edge of instilling fear. The Pax Romana, after all, wasn't just maintained by diplomatic niceties, but by the very real threat of Roman legions turning up on your doorstep if you got too rowdy. So, what would the Assyrians think of their unexpected fame as history's original war strategists? Would they bask in the glow of academic papers and History Channel specials? Probably not. These were folks who valued results over recognition, and the idea of being lauded for their military genius might have been as baffling to them as a smartphone to a Neanderthal. They were practical people, after all, more interested in the spoils of victory than the accolades of posterity. Yet, the irony isn't lost on us, that the very strategies designed to keep their empire secure are now dissected with the same reverence as a fine wine. The Assyrians might have been ruthless, but they were also visionaries, and their methods carved a path through history that will be followed by conquerors and commanders for millennia. Their legacy is a reminder that innovation often springs from necessity, that the fires of adversity can forge tools of transformation. In the grand tapestry of history, the Assyrians are more than just the villains of the ancient world. They're the architects of military strategy, the grandfathers of logistical genius, and the unsung influencers of warfare as we know it. Whether through iron, intimidation, or intricate road networks, their story is one of audacity and adaptability, a testament to the enduring power of human ingenuity to shape the world, even from the harshest of beginnings. So, the next time you hear tales of the Assyrian Empire, remember that their story is more than just bones and blood. It's a saga of survival and supremacy, a narrative that continues to echo through time. And as you drift off to sleep with new knowledge swirling in your mind, consider this. The Assyrians might have been the original bad boys of history, but they were also the pioneers who blazed a trail for every empire that followed in their formidable footsteps. Back in the 17th century BC, Anatolia was a bustling crossroads teeming with tribes, each one dreaming of greatness, or at least of not getting trampled by the neighbors. Amidst this chaotic tapestry, a scrappy band of Anatolian upstarts decided it was high time they penned their own chapter of history. Enter the Hittites, a group that would soon shake the ancient world with their cunning, chariots, and a bit of accidental metallurgy. The Hittites, unlike the Mesopotamians or Egyptians with their grandiose monuments and deities who moonlighted as soap opera stars, started with more modest ambitions. They didn't have pyramids or hanging gardens. They had a desire to stop being the doormat of every passing conqueror. The Hittite kingdom was founded by Labarna I around 1680 BC. Now, Labarna, not exactly a name that rolls off the tongue like Cleopatra or Nebuchadnezzar, was the king who put the Hittites on the map. And by map, I mean a collection of clay tablets. Papyrus wasn't exactly their thing. Labarna's reign marked a period of aggressive expansion. He wasn't content with just sitting pretty in Hadusa, the Hittite capital nestled snugly in central Anatolia. No, he wanted more. So, did what any ambitious king would do. He took his armies on a little road trip, conquering neighboring territories. But it wasn't just brute force that got the job done. Labarna was smart, or perhaps just pragmatic. He adopted a strategy of diplomacy through marriage, essentially turning neighboring princes into sons-in-law, whether they liked it or not. They probably didn't have much of a choice in the matter, considering Labarna's army was likely camped on their doorstep. Now, speaking of armies, let's talk about the Hittite military. They were no ragtag bunch. By the time of Labarna's successors, like Hadusili I and Mursili I, the Hittites had refined their war machine into something worthy of envy and fear. The secret weapon, chariots. Yes, those two-wheeled marvels that allowed a warrior to rain arrows on foot soldiers who were lucky if they had a pair of decent sandals. The Hittites didn't invent the chariot, but they sure did perfect it. Their models were lightweight and fast, the ancient equivalent of a sports car, if said sports car was pulled by horses and shot arrows. But the Hittites weren't just about horsepower. They stumbled upon something that would change warfare forever: iron. Now, it wasn't like they uncovered a fully operational smelting plant in their backyard. Iron smelting was more like a happy accident. You know, the kind where you're trying to do one thing and end up discovering something else entirely. They didn't have the slightest clue they were ushering in the Iron Age. They were just trying to make stronger tools and weapons. And boy, did it work. Iron was more durable than bronze, meaning Hittite weapons didn't just bend or break after a couple of swings. This gave them a significant edge in battle, literally and figuratively. The expansion of the Hittite kingdom under early kings like Laban I and his successors wasn't just a series of conquests. It was the weaving of a complex web of alliances and rivalries. The Hittites didn't operate in a vacuum. They were surrounded by other ambitious players, like the Egyptians and the Babylonians, who weren't exactly keen on sharing power. The Hittites had to navigate this treacherous geopolitical landscape with both guile and grit. They played the long game, knowing full well that empires weren't built in a day, or without a few strategic betrayals. As the Hittite kingdom grew, so did their reputation for being both formidable and, let's say, resourceful. Through a combination of military might, strategic marriages, and a little bit of metallurgy magic, they transformed from a forgotten footnote into a force that could rival the greatest powers of the ancient world, and all this from a kingdom that started as little more than a dart on the fringes of civilization. The Hittites might not have been as flashy as the Egyptians or as philosophically inclined as the Greeks, but they proved that sometimes ambition and a knack for innovation could forge an empire from iron and willpower. And then came Sepululima I, a name that might twist your tongue, but also one that twisted the fate of empires. We're talking about the 14th century BC, a time when the Hittites were no longer content with being the underdogs. They wanted the whole bone, and under Sepululima, boy, did they gnaw at it. Think of him as the ancient world's power broker, the kind of king who'd make Machiavelli look like an amateur. He didn't just want to play the game, he wanted to rewrite the rules. Sepululima's rise to power was no accident. Picture a world where diplomacy was as much about who you knew as it was about the size of your army. Under his reign, the Hittites didn't just wield swords and spears. They wielded marriage alliances, treaties, and a fair bit of strategic backstabbing. Sepululima was the kind of leader who knew that sometimes the pen, or the clay tablet, was mightier than the sword. And when it wasn't, well, he had a pretty hefty sword arm to back it up. One of his crowning achievements was the conquest of Syria, a region that was a veritable buffet of resources and trade routes. But taking Syria wasn't as simple as marching in with an army and planting a flag. It involved a series of cunning moves worthy of a chess grandmaster. Sepululima first weakened his rivals by driving a wedge between them. When Egypt's pharaoh Akhenaten was more concerned with worshipping the sun disk, Aten, than keeping an eye on his borders, Sepululima seized the opportunity, snatching up Syrian cities like a sharper at a clearance sale. But here's the twist. While the royal annals would have you believe that every city fell at the mere sight of the Hittite chariots, the reality was messier. Ancient warfare wasn't about swift, clean victories. It was about long sieges, supply chain headaches, and soldiers who were probably more worried about their next meal than glory. Sepululima's campaigns were as much about logistics as they were about tactics. Feeding an army on the move was no picnic. Imagine trying to keep thousands of men fed and hydrated, not to mention the horses. It was a logistical nightmare, akin to planning a cross-country road trip with a few thousand of your closest friends and no GPS. And speaking of soldiers, let's not romanticize their lives. The everyday Hittite soldier wasn't a gleaming hero of legend. More likely, he was a guy who'd been conscripted from his farm, handed a spear, and told to march. His armor might not have been the shiny stuff of Hollywood epics, but rather a patchwork of leather and bronze. His daily bread, probably more like daily gruel if he was lucky. Ancient armies were a far cry from the disciplined legions of Rome or the professional ranks of a modern military. They were rowdy, ragtag, and probably smelled about as pleasant as you'd expect after a week on the march. But still, the myth of the mighty Hittite army persists. The allure of the chariot-riding warriors, sweeping across the plains, is hard to resist. It's a romantic image that gets more than a little embellishment in the retelling. Yet, behind every tale of battlefield glory, there are tales of exhaustion, disease, and the simple human desire to get back home in one piece. As for Suppiluliuma, his mastery wasn't just in battle, but in the art of making his enemies do the heavy lifting. He was known for turning foes into friends, at least until they were useful, a kind of ancient version of keeping your enemies closer. His reign was marked by treaties that were as much about showmanship as they were about substance. The Hittite version of peace often meant, we won, you pay tribute. And if you didn't, well, let's just say negotiations would resume, sword in hand. This was a time when royal propaganda was in full swing. The Hittite records, carved into stone or pressed into clay, told of great victories and divine favor. They were the ancient world's version of a press release, meant to bolster the king's image both at home and abroad. But between the lines of these grandiose claims lay the gritty truth of ancient power. It was a constant balancing act, one misstep away from disaster. Suppiluliuma's success was as much about his ability to adapt and improvise as it was about his military prowess. In the grand tapestry of history, Suppiluliuma stands out as a master strategist, a king who didn't just play the game but reshaped it. His reign marked a high point for the Hittite Empire, a period of expansion and influence. Yet, for all his achievements, the realities of empire building remained. The constant need for resources, the danger of overextension, and the ever-present threat of rebellion or invasion. The story of the Hittite rise under Suppiluliuma is one of ambition tempered by the hard truths of power, a testament to the fact that in the ancient world, as in ours, every empire is built on a foundation of both dreams and dirt. As Suppiluliuma's legacy loomed large, a new chapter was being written for the Hittite Empire under the capable hands of Muwatalli II. If Suppiluliuma was the architect of Hittite power, Muwatalli was the guy tasked with maintaining the house. No small feat in a neighborhood where everyone was itching to host a wrecking ball party. Muwatalli II inherited an empire that was as much a patchwork of alliances as it was a power keg primed to blow, and his reign would be defined by one of the most famous showdowns of the ancient world, the Battle of Kadesh. Let's set the stage. The year is 1274 BC, and the Hittites are squaring off against the Egyptians, led by the self-proclaimed god on earth, Ramses II. Kadesh, a vital city in Syria, was the prize, a strategic gold mine controlling access to trade routes that were the ancient equivalent of the Silk Road. Whoever held Kadesh controlled the flow of goods, and more importantly, the flow of power. For both Muwatalli and Ramses, losing was not an option. The stakes could not have been higher, and the battlefield was the ultimate high-stakes poker table, with both leaders going all in. Muwatalli II, showcasing his tactical chops, managed to muster an army of around 40,000 men, including 500 chariots, essentially the ancient world's version of a tank battalion. These chariots weren't just for show. They were designed for speed and maneuverability, allowing the Hittites to execute swift, punishing raids. The Hittites were experts in the art of the feigned retreat, a tactic where they'd pretend to flee, only to swing back with devastating force. It was the equivalent of a military sucker punch, and nobody pulled it off quite like the Hittites. Meanwhile, Ramses II, never one to shy away from a grand entrance, rolled into battle with an equally impressive force, reportedly numbering between 20,000 to 25,000 men. His chariots, though fewer in number, were no less formidable. Ramses was a master of image, and his army was as much about spectacle as it was about strength. Think of him as the ancient world's PR guru, spinning tales of divine right and invincibility. In Ramses' world, perception was reality, and he was intent on crafting a narrative where he emerged as the undisputed hero. The battle itself was a complex ballet of strategy and chaos. Muwatalli, with an eye for deception, split his forces, hiding a significant portion of his army behind Kadesh. Ramses, believing the city was lightly defended, rushed in, only to find himself ambushed by the hidden Hittite forces. It was a classic trap, and for a moment it seemed the Hittites might crush the Egyptians in one fell swoop. But Ramses, ever the showman, managed to rally his troops, reportedly calling on the guards themselves for aid, a move that might have been more about morale than divine intervention. Despite the Hittites' initial success, the battle devolved into a bloody stalemate. Neither side could claim a decisive victory, and as the dust settled, both armies were forced to retreat. The outcome was as clear as mud. But what happened next was a masterclass in ancient spin. Ramses, never one to let facts get in the way of a good story, returned to Egypt proclaiming a grand victory. He commissioned monuments, inscriptions, and even poetry, all extolling his heroic triumph. It was history's first major case of fake news, with Ramses spinning the narrative so effectively that many believed his version for millennia. Muwatalli, on the other hand, wasn't quite as concerned with the PR game. For him, the fact that Kadesh remained in Hittite hands was proof enough of victory. But here's where things get interesting. While Ramses was busy engraving his victory into stone, Muwatalli focused on the more mundane yet essential tasks of statecraft, like consolidating his hold over the region. He knew that in the brutal world of ancient geopolitics, holding territory was far more important than holding onto a narrative. Now, let's step back and take a look at the bigger picture. The Battle of Kadesh is often romanticized as a clash of titans, a duel of great kings, but the reality was far grittier. The battlefield was a chaotic mess, with soldiers fighting in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Battle tactics were as much about survival as they were about strategy, and the average soldier's experience was a far cry from the heroic epics told in royal courts. For the men on the ground, it was less about glory and more about getting through the day alive. And yet, for all its messiness, Kadesh was a turning point. It marked the peak of Hittite power under Muwatalli and showcased the empire's ability to stand toe-to-toe with the likes of Egypt. It was a testament to the Hittites' military prowess and strategic acumen, qualities that had propelled them from the fringes of Anatolia to the forefront of ancient power dynamics. But what about Ramses' version of events? His portrayal of Kadesh as a resounding victory is a classic example of ancient spin doctoring, a reminder that history is often written by those with the loudest megaphones, not necessarily the truest accounts. Ramses understood the power of narrative, and his ability to shape public perception was as much a weapon as any sword or chariot. In the end, the Battle of Kadesh is a story of ambition, strategy, and the eternal human quest for power and legacy. It's a reminder that history is not just about what happened, but about who gets to tell the story. As we leave Muwatalli Roman II and Ramses Roman II in the swirling dust of Kadesh, we find a narrative still unfolding, full of intrigue, power plays, and the ever-present shadow of what might have been. Stay tuned, because the saga of the Hittite Empire is far from over. As we leave Muwatalli Roman II and Ramses Roman II in the swirling dust of Kadesh, the Hittite Empire stands at a precarious zenith, victorious in survival, if not in glory. Yet, like any story that teeters on a knife's edge, what goes up must inevitably face gravity's unforgiving tug. The Hittites were about to discover that the climb up was the easy part. The descent, however, will be fraught with enough internal drama and external chaos to rival a Shakespearean tragedy, only with more chariots and fewer soliloquies. First, let's talk about the internal strife, which was less family feud and more Game of Thrones without the dragons. The Hittite royal family had a penchant for intrigue that would make a soap opera writer blush. Succession disputes were basically the family sport, with brothers, sons, and nephews all vying for a piece of the imperial pie. It's the kind of dysfunction that makes the phrase, keeping it in the family, sound less like a motto and more like a warning label. Take the case of Tudhaliya Roman IV, who ascended the throne around 1237 BC. His reign was riddled with enough backstabbing to fill a murder mystery novel. To say that his path to power was smooth would be a lie akin to claiming the Hittites invented Wi-Fi. Tudhaliya had to contend with internal rebellions and familial plots, not to mention the occasional assassination attempt. It was a time when the royal guard likely spent as much time watching their king's back as they did the borders. But if Tudhaliya thought his problems were all in-house, he was sorely mistaken. The Hittites were also facing the not-so-friendly neighborhood watch known as the Sea Peoples. Who were these mysterious maritime marauders? Well, it's a bit like asking who's behind your spam emails. Everyone has a theory, but no one really knows for sure. They've been variously identified as dislocated Mycenaeans, rebellious Trojans, or just your run-of-the-mill ancient pirates. What we do know is that around 1200 BC, these seafaring nomads descended upon the Mediterranean like a plague, leaving chaos in their wake. The Sea Peoples were like the rock stars of ancient warfare, crashing uninvited into coastal settlements from Anatolia to Egypt. Their attacks contributed to the destabilization of many a civilization, and the Hittites were no exception. The once mighty empire found itself stretched thinner than a toga at a Greek wedding. Imagine trying to defend your borders when every coastal city sends out an SOS, and the only thing more unpredictable than the sea peoples is the weather. Speaking of which, the Hittites had to contend with another invisible enemy, climate change. Now, I'm not talking about polar ice caps or carbon footprints. This was the late Bronze Age, after all, not the late Industrial Age. But climate anomalies around 1200 BC led to droughts that made farming a nightmare. Agriculture was the backbone of the Hittite economy, and when the rains stopped, so did the food supply. Grain shortages meant hungry citizens, and hungry citizens meant unrest. The gods of weather had thrown a wrench into the Hittite machine, and it was starting to seize up. Economically, the empire was on shaky ground. The costs of maintaining a sprawling territory with a restless population were escalating faster than a chariot on a downhill race. The Hittite treasury, once flush from tribute and trade, began to feel the pinch. It was like trying to balance a budget with one hand tied behind your back and the other hand feeding an insatiable military machine. Not exactly a recipe for fiscal stability. In terms of governance, the later Hittite rulers were not exactly models of prudence and foresight. Political blunders were as common as clay tablets in Hadusa. Take the decision to centralize power, for instance. In theory, it sounded like a great idea. In practice, it meant that local governors were stripped of authority, leading to resentment and rebellion. It's the kind of top-down management that would make a modern CEO cringe. The empire was slowly unraveling, and the threads were being pulled by both internal dissent and external threats. Let's not forget the rich tapestry of Hittite diplomacy, which by this time had become more tangled than a ball of yarn in a kitten's paws. Once mighty treaties that held together the empire's alliances were fraying. Former allies were now potential foes, and trust was scarcer than a sunny day in an Anatolian winter. In trying to juggle so many relationships, the Hittites found themselves dropping more balls than they caught. So, what's the takeaway here? The decline of the Hittite Empire wasn't a single dramatic fall, but a slow, torturous descent marked by mismanagement, betrayal, and forces beyond their control. It's a narrative as old as time. The bigger they are, the harder they fall, and the Hittites were no exception. From the internal palace plots to the external pressures of invasion and famine, the empire was besieged on all sides. Yet, for all the chaos and calamity, there's something almost poetic about the Hittite struggle. They were a people who rose from obscurity to challenge the greatest powers of their age, only to be undone by the very forces they sought to master. Their story is a reminder that in the grand tapestry of history, every thread is woven with a mix of ambition and adversity, triumph and tragedy. As we pause in this tale of ancient intrigue and impending downfall, remember that the Hittite Empire, for all its flaws and failures, left an indelible mark on history. The lessons of their rise and fall echo through the ages, a testament to the complexity of human ambition and the relentless march of time. Stay tuned for the next act, where the story of the Hittites continues to unfold in a saga that's far from over. As we find ourselves tangled in the Hittite Empire's final act, it's clear that their story isn't just a cautionary tale. It's history's version of a blockbuster thriller, complete with dramatic twists and unforeseen pitfalls. By 1178 BC, the Hittites were on the brink, teetering like a Jenga tower built on shaky ground. The empire that once roared across the plains with chariots and iron was now whispering its final goodbyes, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Let's rewind a bit to see how the Hittites' once mighty roar turned into a whisper. It's the late 13th century BC, and the Hittite economy is doing its best impression of a deflated balloon. The treasury, once overflowing with gold and silver tribute, was now emptier than a pharaoh's tomb after a grave robber visit. Trade routes that had pumped lifeblood into Hadusa, the Hittite capital, were now as dry as an Anatolian summer. Why? Well, those pesky sea peoples had a habit of making commerce as treacherous as sailing a paper boat through a hurricane. And speaking of Hadusa, the city itself was in dire straits. Archaeological evidence shows that around this time, the city was abandoned, leaving behind nothing but ghostly echoes of its former grandeur. Imagine a once bustling metropolis suddenly becoming a ghost town, its great halls silent, except for the wind whistling through deserted corridors. It's the ancient equivalent of a post-apocalyptic wasteland, minus the zombies, but with just as much eerie emptiness. Political power wasn't faring much better. The Hittite kings of this period were finding it increasingly difficult to keep a lid on internal dissent. The once tightly knit tapestry of alliances and vassal states was unraveling faster than you could say dynastic instability. The empire, which had once boasted a network of loyal allies, now faced rebellion and betrayal at every turn. Local governors, stripped of power and patience, decided they were better off flying solo than sticking with a sinking ship. It was like a game of historical musical chairs, but the music had stopped, and there weren't enough seats to go around. And then there's the climate. Oh, the climate. It's like Mother Nature decided to throw her own curveball at the Hittites. Droughts, likely tied to climate shifts, wreaked havoc on agriculture, the backbone of their economy. Fields that once yielded bountiful harvests were now as barren as the moon. With food shortages came hunger, and with hunger came unrest. What was once the breadbasket of the empire was now a desolate reminder of nature's unforgiving hand. But here's the kicker. While the Hittites were grappling with their internal woes, the outside world wasn't exactly giving them a breather. The Assyrians, those perennial overachievers, were on the rise, casting a long shadow over their neighbors. The Hittites, once the bullies of the Near East, were now feeling the squeeze from these ambitious upstarts. It's a classic case of the hunter becoming the hunted, and the Hittites were caught in the crosshairs. In this swirling cauldron of chaos, the empire finally crumbled. The year 1178 BC stands as a marker of their fall, a date etched into the annals of history as the end of the Hittite saga. But what really sealed their fate wasn't a single cataclysmic event, but rather the slow, inevitable erosion of power, a death by 1,000 cuts, if you will. The mighty Hittite Empire, once a titan of the ancient world, faded into obscurity, leaving behind little more than enigmatic ruins and a few tantalizing clues for archaeologists to puzzle over. Yet, despite their dramatic demise, the Hittites left behind a legacy that would echo through the ages. Their innovations in chariot warfare and iron smelting paved the way for future advancements. They were the unsung heroes of metallurgy, setting the stage for the full-blown Iron Age that would follow. Their legal codes, among the oldest known, influenced subsequent civilizations, proving that while their empire might have crumbled, their ideas endured. So what lessons can we glean from the Hittite saga? For starters, it's a stark reminder that the trappings of power are as fleeting as a mirage in the desert. Empires rise and fall, but the cycle of ambition and decline is as perpetual as the tides. The Hittites teach us that no matter how mighty one becomes, the forces of nature, economy, and human ambition are relentless, always waiting to reclaim the stage. Moreover, the Hittite story underscores the importance of adaptability. While they were masters of innovation and strategy in their heyday, their inability to adapt to changing circumstances ultimately led to their downfall. It's a tale as old as time, echoed in the rise and fall of countless other empires. Those who fail to adapt to the winds of change are destined to be swept away by them. Reflecting on the Hittites also prompts us to consider the impact of history's forgotten empires. They may not adorn the pages of every textbook or the screens of every documentary, but their contributions to human civilization are undeniable. The Hittites, in their time, were as influential as the Romans or the Egyptians, and their story is a testament to the enduring human penchant for empire building, a cycle as old as civilization itself. As we draw the curtain on the Hittite Empire, let's not forget the lessons they imparted. Their rise and fall offer a mirror to the nature of power, its allure, its impermanence, and its capacity to shape the world in both grand and subtle ways. The Hittites may have slipped into the shadows of history, but their echoes remain, a reminder that every empire, no matter how great, is but a chapter in the ever-unfolding story of humanity. So, as you drift off into a slumber filled with dreams of ancient chariots and forgotten kings, remember, the story of the Hittites, like all great tales, is not just about what was, but what will always be, a testament to the enduring dance of ambition, innovation, and the relentless march of time. In the bustling streets of late 15th century Genoa, a young Giuliano della Rovere probably never dreamed he'd end up as the head of the Catholic Church, let alone earn the nickname Il Papa Terribile. That's the terrible Pope, folks. But then again, who really predicts a future where they're darning a papal tiara and leading armies? Julius Roman II, as he later became known, was nothing if not a master of the unexpected twist, a man who orchestrated his rise with the finesse of a Renaissance maestro, all while avoiding the occasional poisoned chalice from his rivals. Born in 1443, Giuliano was the nephew of Pope Sixtus Roman IV, which is as close to a VIP pass as one could get in the convoluted world of Vatican politics. Having an uncle in high places never hurt anyone, right? His early life was a crash course in ecclesiastical maneuvering. By the time he was in his 20s, Giuliano was already a cardinal, thanks to Uncle Sixtus, who was more than happy to sprinkle a bit of nepotism like Parmesan cheese over a bowl of papal pasta. But don't be fooled into thinking Giuliano was just riding coattails. He was savvy, ambitious, and had a nose for opportunity that would make a truffle pig proud. The papal elections of the time were less about divine inspiration and more akin to a high-stakes poker game, with fortunes in simony, that's bribery dressed up in a cassock, changing hands faster than you could say, Hail Mary. The conclave of 1503 was no different. It was a swirling vortex of ambition, cunning, and a bit of Greco-Roman backstabbing. Giuliano, eyeing the papal throne like a kid at a candy store, knew he had to outsmart not just the competition, but also the ghostly shadow of the Borgia family, who had turned nepotism into an art form themselves. The Borgias, led by the infamous Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI to his friends, were the Kardashians of Renaissance Rome, minus the reality TV show, but with just as many family feuds. Rodrigo had passed away in 1503, leaving a power vacuum the size of St. Peter's Basilica. Giuliano, ever the opportunist, saw his moment. He played the political chessboard like a grandmaster, securing votes through promises, alliances, and yes, the occasional well-placed bribe. The price for a cardinal's vote could reportedly reach 200,000 ducats, a sum that would make any modern bank account wince. But let's not pretend this was all just a game of Monopoly for the holy set. At stake was the leadership of Christendom, a role that came with the power to shape not just religious doctrine, but the political landscape of Europe. Giuliano understood the stakes and played his cards with the precision of a surgeon, if that surgeon also had a penchant for artillery and military campaigns. When Giuliano finally ascended to the papacy as Julius Roman II, he was 60 years old, a ripe age by Renaissance standards, when most folks were already 1 foot in the grave. His election was a testament to his relentless ambition and strategic brilliance, even if the latter sometimes involved tactics that would scandalize a modern HR department. But hey, in a world where cardinals were practically the CEOs of their time, it was all just part of the job description. The rise of Julius Roman II is a tale rich in irony and strategic genius, punctuated by the sometimes absurd realities of Renaissance politics. As Pope, he would go on to commission Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling and lead military campaigns, embodying the very definition of a warrior pope. But as a young cardinal, his journey to the papacy was a testament to his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of Rome with both humor and guile, proving that sometimes the divine right is just a well-played hand away. And just like that, Julius Roman II was no longer just a papal puppet master. He was the man behind the throne, the puppet who cut his own strings. He had risen from the political swamps of Rome to the pinnacle of religious power. But what he did next was straight out of a medieval action flick. You see, Julius wasn't content with the usual papal duties like blessing the occasional congregation or hosting lavish banquets. No, he had bigger fish to fry, or should we say bigger territories to reclaim. Enter the papal states, a patchwork of lands that looked more like a jigsaw puzzle waiting for someone with a map and a sword to sort it out. Now, the image of a pope in gleaming armor, charging into battle, might seem like something out of a Monty Python sketch, but Julius was dead serious. He wasn't just any pope, he was a Renaissance Rambo. His plan, to restore the papal states to their former glory, one skirmish at a time. It was a bold move, not least because the Papal States had been getting picked apart by ambitious neighbors like France, Spain, and those pesky Italian city-states that seemed to breed conflict like rabbits on espresso. In 1506, Julius made his move on Bologna, a city currently under the thumb of the Bentivoglio family, who were about as willing to give up power as a toddler is to share a favorite toy. With a military campaign that would make even the most battle-hardened generals sit up and take note, Julius donned his armor, yes, actual metal armor, and led his troops with the vigor of a man half his age. The sight of the Supreme Pontiff leading an army was a spectacle to behold, the kind of thing that made you wonder if you were witnessing history or a particularly vivid fever dream. But it wasn't all about glory and gallantry. Julius's military escapades were a logistical and financial nightmare. Armies don't run on faith alone, and Julius's campaigns were bleeding the Vatican's coffers dry faster than you could say indulgence. The cost of maintaining troops, weaponry, and the various accoutrements of war was astronomical. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of ducats, a small fortune that could have just as easily built another Sistine Chapel or two. The Pope's ambitions were weighing heavy on the Church's purse, and not in a metaphorical sense. Yet, despite the economic strain, Julius's campaigns were a short-term success. Bologna fell to his forces, and with it, Julius reasserted papal authority over the region. The victory was like a shot of adrenaline for his papacy, boosting his prestige and reminding everyone that he wasn't just another Vatican bureaucrat. But the cost of this military grandeur was a heavy burden, one that would have consequences for the Church long after Julius had hung up his armor. Julius's military ventures were an odd mix of medieval warfare and Renaissance politics, a reflection of a time when papal authority was both a spiritual and temporal force. The Pope wasn't just a religious leader. He was a political powerhouse, with a penchant for power plays that would make Machiavelli proud, or perhaps a little envious. And let's not forget the economic ripple effects. The drain on papal resources meant fewer funds for other projects, including those iconic Renaissance artworks we all know and love. In the grand tapestry of history, Julius's campaigns were both a testament to his ambition and a cautionary tale about the costs of power. He was a warrior pope, in a time when popes weren't expected to wield swords, a leader who understood that sometimes the divine right needed a little reinforcement from the business end of a pike. But as the Vatican's coffers ran dangerously low, it was clear that his military exploits were as much a gamble as they were a strategy. So, while Julius Roman II might have left a mark as the Pope who wore armor as comfortably as he wore a cassock, his legacy was a complex weave of glory and financial strain. It was a reminder of the delicate balance between spiritual leadership and secular ambition, a balance that Julius walked like a tightrope artist with a penchant for the dramatic. And as he continued his campaigns, the world watched, riveted, wondering what this warrior pope would do next. Because with Julius, one thing was certain. The story was far from over. Julius Roman II, ever the Renaissance maestro, wasn't just orchestrating military campaigns. He was also composing a symphony of diplomatic maneuvers that would make even Machiavelli stroke his chin in admiration. You see, in the grand chess game of European politics, Julius was less the king and more the knight, zigzagging across the board in unpredictable, often baffling ways. His allegiances shifted with the agility of a contortionist, leaving allies scratching their heads and enemies clutching their pearls. Take his relationship with France, for instance. In one breath, Julius was buddying up to Louis Roman XII, the French king, like they were old college roommates. In the next, he was plotting ways to squeeze French influence out of Italy like juice from a too-ripe lemon. This wasn't fickleness, mind you, but rather a cold, calculated strategy. Julius needed French support to fend off the pesky Venetians, who were treating the Papal States like their own personal buffet. So, in 1504, he swallowed his pride and inked an alliance with France, knowing full well that keeping your enemies closer wasn't just good advice. It was the only game in town. But true to his Machiavellian nature, Julius wasn't about to let France get too comfortable. He had a plan up his sleeve that would do Houdini proud. Enter the League of Cambrai, a diplomatic concoction so complex it could have been brewed up by a mad scientist with a penchant for political chaos. Formed in 1508, the League brought together some of the biggest players in Europe, France, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and the Papal States. Their common target, Venice. For Julius, it was a masterstroke, a chance to knock Venice down a peg or two while keeping his own hands relatively clean. Now, if you think getting France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire to agree on anything was easy, think again. These guys were like a trio of cats in a sack, each with their own agendas and ambitions. Yet somehow, Julius managed to make it work, wielding his diplomatic wand with the skill of a seasoned illusionist. It was part comedy, part tragedy, as these grand powers came together under a banner of united disdain for Venice, while secretly plotting against each other behind closed doors. For Julius, the League of Cambrai was a chance to flex his diplomatic muscles and remind everyone that the papacy was still a force to be reckoned with. But it was also a tightrope walk over a pit of political vipers, each waiting for the moment to pounce. While the League initially succeeded in humbling Venice, the alliance was as stable as a house of cards in a wind tunnel. France and Spain were eyeing each other with suspicion. Holy Roman Emperor was contemplating his own territorial ambitions, and Julius was left juggling these volatile alliances like a Renaissance-era jester. The comedy of errors didn't stop there. In a twist worthy of Shakespeare, Julius soon found himself at odds with his former allies. By 1510, the French, once his partners in crime, were now the new villains in his ever-evolving narrative. Julius, with his characteristic flair for the dramatic, excommunicated Louis Roman XII, branding him a heretic and declaring open season on French troops in Italy. It was a bold move, one that sent shockwaves across Europe, leaving onlookers wondering if Julius had finally gone off the deep end. But in reality, it was another calculated gamble. Julius wanted to reclaim lost territories and cement his legacy as the ultimate warrior pope, and if that meant making frenemies out of old allies, so be it. Of course, none of this was happening in a vacuum. The economic realities of the time were as complex as the political ones. Julius's military and diplomatic escapades weren't cheap, and the Vatican's coffers were feeling the strain. The cost of war and alliance building was astronomical, with expenses climbing into the hundreds of thousands of ducats. Julius was essentially playing a high-stakes game of poker with the church's treasury, betting big on his ability to outmaneuver Europe's finest. Yet despite the financial toll and the ever-shifting alliances, Julius's strategies were a testament to his uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics. He was a pope who understood that, in a world where power was as transitory as a summer breeze, you had to grab hold of every opportunity and bend it to your will. His Machiavellian tactics, while often exasperating to his contemporaries, were a reflection of his deep understanding of the complex interplay between diplomacy, warfare, and economic necessity. In the end, Julius Roman II was as much a product of his time as he was a shaper of it. His diplomatic maneuvers were an art form, a testament to his ability to wield power with both comedy and cunning. And while his alliances may have shifted like sand underfoot, his legacy as a master strategist endured, a reminder that sometimes the path to greatness is paved with a mix of brilliance and bravado. As the dust settled over the League of Cambrai and its tangled web of alliances, one thing was clear. Julius Roman II, the warrior pope, had left an indelible mark on the world stage, and his story was far from over. And so, while Julius Roman II busied himself with playing Europe's political chessboard like a caffeinated grandmaster, also turned his attention towards something that wouldn't require quite so much sidestepping: art and architecture. If Julius was a maestro of military and diplomatic might, he was equally a virtuoso of cultural patronage, with an eye for talent that would make Simon Cowell nod in approval. Enter the Sistine Chapel ceiling, a project that would become one of his most enduring legacies, if he could just rein in his artist. Now, when we think of Michelangelo, we tend to picture a solitary genius, paintbrush in hand, creating masterpieces with divine inspiration. But let's dispel that myth right away. The reality is, Michelangelo was a bit like the tortured artist archetype on steroids, complete with a penchant for drama that would make a soap opera villain blush. And Julius Roman II, well, he was the demanding patron every artist loves to hate. In 1508, Julius commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, a project that would span 4 grueling years and test the patience of both pope and artist. The chapel, originally built by Pope Sixtus Roman IV, Julius's uncle, was already an architectural gem. But Julius wanted it to be a showcase of divine splendor, something that would make even the angels stop and stare. He envisioned something grandiose, a ceiling that would not just depict the heavens, but elevate the viewer to them. Michelangelo, however, was less than thrilled. You see, he considered himself a sculptor, not a painter. In fact, he was knee-deep in sculpting the Pope's own tomb, a project that Julius seemed to forget about faster than a New Year's resolution. The tension between them was palpable, like a Renaissance version of a buddy cop movie where neither buddy gets along. Julius, with the patience of a ticking time bomb, wanted the ceiling done yesterday, while Michelangelo, ever the perfectionist, agonized over every brushstroke. Their relationship was a comedic ballet of artistic genius meeting papal impatience. To add to the comedy of errors, Michelangelo worked under less than ideal conditions. He painted standing up on a scaffold, with paint and plaster falling into his eyes, a far cry from the idyllic image of a serene artist in a sunlit studio. And yet, despite the physical and emotional toll, Michelangelo's work was nothing short of miraculous. The ceiling became a canvas for biblical narratives, a sprawling epic of creation and humanity that would leave viewers awestruck for centuries to come. But let's not ignore the elephant in the Vatican, the cost. Julius's artistic ambitions didn't come cheap. The Sistine Chapel project alone cost approximately 3,000 ducats, a hefty sum in the early 16th century. In today's money, we're talking millions of dollars, enough to make any church accountant break out in a cold sweat. Yet for Julius, this was pocket change compared to the legacy he sought to leave. In a time when the church was synonymous with power, art was as potent a weapon as any sword, a means to project authority, inspire faith, and of course, outshine the neighbors. And Julius's vision didn't stop at the Sistine Chapel. He commissioned Raphael to work on the Vatican stands, a series of rooms that would become masterpieces in their own right. Raphael's frescoes, brimming with classical themes and vibrant colors, were part of Julius's broader plan to transform Rome into the cultural capital of the world, a Renaissance Disneyland, if you will, designed to dazzle visiting dignitaries and intimidate rival states. But as with any grand design, there were economic strings attached. The Vatican's coffers, already strained by Julius's military escapades, were stretched to their limits. Financing these projects required a delicate dance of patronage and politics, with funds being diverted from other church activities. The church had to rely on increasingly creative methods of fundraising, including the controversial sale of indulgences, a practice that would later become a lightning rod for reformers like Martin Luther. While Julius's artistic vision was undeniably grand, it also illuminated the darker side of papal ambition. The Pope's relentless pursuit of glory through cultural patronage was as much about ego as it was about faith, a testament to the complex interplay between spirituality and vanity. Yet, despite the economic strain and the occasional artistic tantrum, Julius's contributions to the arts were a resounding success, leaving a legacy that would endure long after his papal tiara had gathered dust. In the end, Julius Roman II's story is one of contrasts, a warrior pope with an artist's heart, a spiritual leader who wielded both the sword and the paintbrush with equal fervor. His reign was a testament to the power of vision, a reminder that even in the corridors of power, art could be as potent a tool as diplomacy or warfare. And as the Sistine Chapel ceiling stood resplendent, a masterpiece for the ages, it was clear that Julius had achieved his ultimate goal. He had crafted not just a legacy, but a legend. Yet, as the frescoes dried and the dust settled, the story of Julius Roman II was far from over. He had set the stage for a cultural renaissance that would shape the world, but the seeds of discord he had sown through his policies and ambitions were just beginning to sprout. The church would soon face challenges that would test its very foundations, and Julius's legacy, both glorious and contentious, would be at the heart of it all. So stay tuned, because the next chapter in this grand historical saga is just around the corner. With Julius Roman II artistic triumphs set in marble and fresco, the stage was indeed set for the next act of history's relentless theater. Yet, as the paint dried on Michelangelo's celestial visions, and the Vatican's coffers echoed with the sound of ducats well spent, the legacy of the warrior pope continued to reverberate through the corridors of power, both sacred and secular. Julius's reign was a paradox wrapped in a papal robe, a tale of ambition and artistry, power and piety, with an ending that left audiences both awestruck and bewildered. Let's start with the elephant in the Sistine Chapel, Julius's militaristic exploits. The Monaco warrior pope conjures images of a pontiff wielding a sword more comfortably than a scepter, and while that's not far off, it's a tad more complex. Sure, Julius donned armor and led troops like some avenging angel of the Vatican, but it wasn't just about territorial pissing contests. His military campaigns were aimed at consolidating the Papal States, which had all the cohesiveness of a toddler's jigsaw puzzle. The Papal States were the Vatican's political playground, and Julius wanted them to be the best on the block, free from the meddling hands of European powers. Yet this bellicose approach didn't win him universal applause. Some contemporaries thought Julius's martial vigor was more befitting a warlord than a spiritual leader. But here's the kicker. Julius believed in his divine mandate to protect the church's earthly dominions, and if that meant clashing swords with Europe's elite, so be it. His campaigns, costly as they were, succeeded in reasserting papal authority, albeit temporarily. The papacy was left with a reinforced, albeit contentious, position on the European stage, a legacy that resembled a double-edged sword. Now, about that sword's other edge, Julius's patronage of the arts. This was a pope who saw beauty as a divine language, one that could communicate the church's glory without a single word spoken. Under his watch, Rome was transformed into a Renaissance wonderland. Buildings rose like phoenixes from the ashes of antiquity, adorned with artworks that could rival the heavens themselves. Consider the Sistine Chapel, a project that might have cost a fortune, but resulted in a masterpiece whose value defies calculation. Julius's vision wasn't just about beautifying Rome. It was about cementing the church's influence through culture, creating a legacy of splendor that would endure long after the echoes of his military campaigns had faded. However, let's not romanticize it too much. The economic burden of Julius's projects was staggering. The Vatican's financial wizards had to perform fiscal gymnastics to keep the church's budget from imploding. Indulgences were sold like hotcakes, a practice that, while lucrative, sowed the seeds of dissent that would blossom into the Reformation. Martin Luther, for one, had a thing or two to say about the moral implications of financing spiritual enlightenment through what he saw as a celestial cash grab. So, while Julius's artistic ventures left an indelible print, they also left the Vatican in a precarious financial dance with reform and rebellion. Julius's dual legacy as both patron and pope warrior created a papal playbook that was as inspiring as it was controversial. He reframed what it meant to be pope, blending spiritual leadership with secular power in ways that both awed and appalled. His papacy was a balancing act on the high wire of history, where every step was fraught with the potential for greatness or disaster. In the end, Julius Roman II's story is a cocktail of contradictions. A devout man who wielded the sword as readily as the brush, a church leader who fought as fiercely for territory as he did for artistic triumph. His legacy is a kaleidoscope of martial might and artistic achievement, a testament to the complex interplay of faith, power, and humanity. As history looks back on Julius, it sees a mosaic composed of both light and shadow, each piece reflecting the multifaceted nature of his papacy. And so, as today's historians peer into the past, Julius Roman II stands as a reminder that the path to greatness is often paved with paradox. His legacy, like his life, defies simple categorization, proving that sometimes the most compelling stories are those that leave us with more questions than answers. Yet, in the grand tableau of history, Julius Roman II remains a figure as enigmatic as he is extraordinary, a true Renaissance pope who left an indelible mark on the world, one fresco and fortress at a time. In the grand theater of ancient history, where pyramids and pharaohs usually steal the spotlight, there's a lesser-known yet equally fascinating act taking place just south of the Egyptian border. Welcome to the kingdom of Kush, a land that thrived between the first and sixth cataracts of the Nile, stretching across what is today northern Sudan. This isn't just any historical subplot. It's a tale of a civilization that played the role of Egypt's southern neighbor, sometime rival, and occasional conqueror. In other words, Kush was the ambitious sibling who sometimes borrowed Egypt's crown without asking. Let's set the stage with geography, because nothing says I'm serious about history like a good old-fashioned map. Picture the Nile River not just as a great divider, but as a unifier, a lifeline snaking through the Sahara, making the impossible a reality. A thriving civilization amidst the sand dunes and arid landscapes. The Nile's cataracts, those churning rapids and rocky stretches, were like nature's version of a speed bump, slowing down invaders and traders alike. The first cataract near Aswan marked the traditional border with Egypt, while the sixth, near modern-day Khartoum, defined the southern extent of Kushite influence. Now, let's dive into the early history of this kingdom. Some 4,000 years ago, the ancient Nubians, the forebears of the Kushites, were already busy building their society along the banks of the Nile. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of their existence as far back as 2500 BCE, which, if you're counting, is about the same time the pyramids of Giza were being constructed. It's as if the Nubians looked over at their northern neighbors and thought, hey, we can do civilization too. The connection between Nubia and Egypt is a fascinating saga of cultural exchange, trade, and occasionally outright domination. The Egyptians, ever the trendsetters in the ancient world, were quick to notice the wealth of resources that Nubia had to offer. Gold, ivory, ebony, incense, and exotic animals. Nubia was like the ancient Amazon of Africa, delivering goods long before the concept of prime shipping was even a twinkle in Jeff Bezos's eye. Egyptian expeditions headed south with the enthusiasm of modern-day bargain hunters, eager to tap into these riches. But let's not paint Egypt as the only sharper in this scenario. The Nubians were no mere passive suppliers. They were savvy traders and skilled negotiators. They had their own trade networks extending deep into Africa, trading with peoples far beyond Egypt's reach. It's a bit like the Silk Road, minus the silk and more on the side of elephant tusks and leopard skins. This trade was not just a side hustle. It was the backbone of Kushite wealth, funding their elaborate tombs and temples and supporting a society that could stand toe-to-toe with their northern neighbors. And this is where the tale gets juicy. You see, the Egyptians and Nubians were like frenemies before the term was trendy. They traded and influenced each other's cultures, but there was always an undercurrent of rivalry. The Egyptians, with their penchant for expansion, occasionally thought it would be a splendid idea to annex Nubia. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs, around 2000 BCE, decided Nubia's resources looked better on their balance sheets than on Nubia's. Few military campaigns, fortresses along the Nile, and a few centuries of Egyptian control. However, the Nubians were not ones to be subdued forever. As the Egyptian Middle Kingdom waned, around 1700 BCE, the Nubians saw their chance. The kingdom of Kush emerged from the shadows, establishing its capital at Kerma, near the Third Cataract. Kerma was a city to rival Thebes or Memphis, with massive mud-brick temples and palatial structures. The Kushites were not just reclaiming their land, they were asserting their identity. It was like a historical game of Jenga, where one kingdom's loss was another's gain. The influence wasn't all one-sided, though. As the Kushites rose, they absorbed Egyptian elements into their culture, from religion to architecture. But they didn't just copy and paste. They remixed it, Nubia style. Take their pyramids, for instance. Sure, they were inspired by Egypt, but Kushite pyramids were smaller, steeper, and more numerous, like saying, my pyramids are more Instagrammable than yours. And when it came to the gods, the Kushites worshipped Egyptian deities, but also had a pantheon of their own, with Apidamak, the lion-headed war god, striding mightily into their hearts. This cultural exchange was a two-way street, and it's a testament to the interconnectedness of ancient civilizations. However, it wasn't all cumbare and cultural harmony. There were power plays and political maneuvering aplenty. Egypt was a bit like that older sibling who alternates between mentoring and monopolizing, and Nubia was the younger sibling who learned quickly, eventually standing on its own, and at times even surpassing its elder. In summary, the early history of the Kingdom of Kush is a tale of resilience and adaptation, of a people not content to be a footnote in someone else's story. They took the cards history dealt them and played a brilliant hand, turning trade into an empire and influence into independence. As we continue this saga in later parts, we'll see how Kush's fortunes rose and fell, how they became pharaohs of Egypt, and how their legacy echoes through history. But for now, let's leave the Nubians on the banks of the Nile, trading, building, and plotting their next move in the grand chess game of ancient history. As the Nubians plodded by the Nile, dreaming of grandeur and conquest, the stage was set for one of history's most audacious power plays. Enter the Napatan period, around 750 BCE, when the Kushite kingdom decided to trade its backstage pass for a starring role in the grand opera of ancient Egypt. Now, this was not just a case of keeping up with the pharaohs. This was a full-on coup that saw Kushite kings donning the double crown and strutting down the Nile like it was their personal catwalk. Get ready, because we're diving into the tale of the Black Pharaohs, a story that's as much about political acumen as it is about sheer audacity. Let's talk about Pi, the Kushite king who kicked off the 25th dynasty like he was starting a dynasty sale at an ancient Egyptian department store. Pi, also known as Pianki, wasn't just a military mastermind. He was a man with a penchant for elaborate political theater. Picture this. Around 750 BCE, Pi took a long, hard look at the fragmented state of Egypt, with its squabbling local rulers who couldn't agree on lunch, let alone governance. He saw opportunity, and like any great strategist, he moved in when his opponents were busy tripping over their own sandals. Pi's campaign to conquer Egypt wasn't just about swinging swords and shouting orders. It was a masterclass in political chess, with Pi as the grandmaster and Egypt's fractured rulers as unwitting pawns. He marched north with a force that was as impressive in its organization as it was in its discipline. And here's where Pi's story takes a turn from the typical conqueror narrative. Instead of just storming in, he orchestrated a series of alliances and sieges that were more about outsmarting than outmuscling. It's like he had an ancient version of Sun Tzu's Art of War tucked under his arm. One of Pi's famous maneuvers was his siege of the city of Heracleopolis, where he didn't just lay waste to the walls. He encircled it with a fleet of ships, a move that was as much about cutting off escape routes as it was about making a statement. The message was clear. Pi was not a passing storm. He was the new ruler of the Nile. His campaign culminated in a dramatic showdown at Memphis, the heart of Lower Egypt, where he faced off against Tefnach, a local ruler who fancied himself the leader of a resistance against Kushite rule. Tefnach's coalition crumbled faster than a stale piece of bread, and Pi's triumphant entry into Memphis was less of a military victory and more of a political masterstroke. Now, here's where things get a bit awkward in the Chronicles of Pi. After his successful campaign, he didn't stick around to bask in his Egyptian conquest. Instead, he returned to Napata, his southern capital, leaving Egypt to be ruled by his appointed viceroys. It's like winning the lottery and then deciding you'd rather live in a modest home than a palace. But this was no retreat. It was a savvy move to maintain control while avoiding the pitfalls of ruling directly over a distant land. Besides, Pi had other interests to tend to, like his beloved horses. Yes, you heard that right. Pi was as famous for his stables as he was for his military campaigns. His love for horses was legendary, and he maintained a stable full of the finest steeds, treating them with the care and reverence usually reserved for royalty. In a way, Pi's governance was like a well-run stable, disciplined, orderly, and ready to gallop at a moment's notice. So, what's the economic backdrop to all this power play? Well, controlling Egypt wasn't just about flaunting a fancy crown. It was about access to resources, grain, gold, and labor, that could fund and sustain the Kushite kingdom. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world, and having it under Kushite control meant that Pi could ensure a steady supply of essentials to Napata and beyond. It was a bit like a corporate merger, where Kush absorbed Egypt's assets without the hostile takeover vibe. And let's not forget the prestige. The 25th dynasty marked an era when the Kushites embraced the full regalia of pharaonic Egypt, with all its pomp and ceremony. They built monumental temples and pyramids in Nubia that rivaled those in the north, blending Egyptian styles with distinctly Kushite flavors. It was a cultural fusion as rich as any ancient exchange, with the Kushites leaving an indelible mark on Egyptian history. But all that glitters isn't gold, and the myth of the benevolent conqueror needs a bit of a reality check. The Kushite rule in Egypt wasn't without its challenges. The local rulers, known as Namarks, were a thorn in Pi's side, constantly testing the limits of Kushite authority. Moreover, the Assyrians, those ancient superpower bullies, were lurking on the horizon, threatening to crash the party with their ironclad armies. The balance of power was as delicate as a papyrus scroll, and maintaining control required more than military might. It needed diplomacy, strategy, and a fair bit of luck. As we leave Pi amidst his horses and political maneuvers, one thing is clear. The rise of the kingdom of Kush during the Napatan period was a story of ambition, resilience, and calculated risks. It was about playing the long game, seeing the board when others saw only pieces. And while Pi himself might have preferred the sands of Nubia to the palaces of Thebes, his legacy as a black pharaoh endures, a testament to a kingdom that dared to rewrite the rules of ancient power. Stay tuned as we continue this saga, where the stakes get higher, the players more cunning, and the outcomes ever more uncertain. The Kushites have only just begun their reign, and the Nile is far from quiet. As the Kushites continued their reign, the Nile's waters carried not just papyrus and lotus flowers, but the whispers of a civilization determined to carve its identity into the annals of history. And where better to make a splash than in the sand-swept lands of Merere, the heart of the Kushite kingdom's architectural and cultural renaissance. If you ever thought the tiny house movement was a hipster innovation, think again. The Kushites were way ahead of the curve, with their pint-sized pyramids darting the landscape like a constellation of ancient urban listings. Merere was not just any city. It was the glittering jewel of the Kushite crown from around 300 BCE. If you've ever imagined a city that rivaled the grandeur of Thebes or Memphis, but with a distinct Nubian twist, Merere was it. This wasn't just a place to live. It was a canvas on which the Kushites painted their ambitions and cultural identity. The city boasted a royal cemetery with over 200 pyramids, each one a pointed testament to the Kushite penchant for architectural flair. While their northern counterparts in Egypt opted for grand, sprawling pyramids that dominated the skyline, the Kushites took a different tack. Their pyramids were more compact, steeper, and clustered in groups, as if the architects had a penchant for cozy gatherings rather than sprawling estates. And hey, who needs a towering giant when a sleek, sharply angled structure will do the trick? These were the original tiny houses of the ancient world, long before minimalist living was cool. Standing at about 20 to 30 meters tall, they were a fraction of the size of the Egyptian behemoths, but packed a punch with their unique style. It was less about grandeur and more about efficiency and elegance, proof that size isn't everything, even in the ancient world. This architectural choice wasn't just a matter of aesthetics. It was a reflection of the Kushites' ability to adapt and innovate, using the resources available to them. They employed local stone rather than the massive limestone blocks favored by the Egyptians, which made construction faster and arguably more sustainable. But let's not get too wrapped up in the bricks and mortar without acknowledging the cultural fusion that was going on under the Kushite rule. The Kushites were like the original cultural magpies, picking and choosing elements from Egyptian traditions while weaving in their own Nubian flair. This was a time when cultural appropriation was less about hashtags and more about hieroglyphs. Egyptian gods danced alongside Nubian deities in the religious texts, creating a pantheon that was as diverse as it was divine. The ancient city of Merere was a melting pot of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman influences, all blending seamlessly with indigenous Nubian culture. Art and sculpture from this period show a fascinating mix of styles. Picture a statue of a pharaoh with distinctly African features, or a temple that boasts both Egyptian reliefs and Nubian motifs. It was like an ancient world's version of fusion cuisine, where Egyptian and Nubian elements mixed to create something entirely new and deliciously complex. Religiously, the Kushites were adept at adopting Egyptian gods while firmly holding onto their own spiritual traditions. Ammon, the chief deity of Thebes, found a home in Nubia, but he often shared the limelight with Apidamak, the lion-headed war god who was as fierce as he was fabulous. Temples to Ammon were constructed in Nubia, but they were adorned with local symbols and inscriptions, creating a unique blend that was both familiar and foreign. This wasn't just a case of copy-paste. It was more like a cultural remix, where the beat of Egyptian tradition played to the rhythm of Nubian innovation. And let's not forget the economic engine that powered all this creativity. Merere was strategically located at the crossroads of several trade routes, connecting it to the riches of sub-Saharan Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Arabian Peninsula. It was a bustling trade hub where gold, ivory, and iron were exchanged for luxury goods from distant lands. The Kushites were masters of metallurgy, and their ironworking skills were legendary. They turned Merer into a center of industry, with furnaces that belched smoke and flame like ancient dragons. This was no small feat, considering the technology of the time, and it gave the Kushites a significant economic edge over their rivals. Of course, with all this cultural and economic blending, there were bound to be some hiccups. The Kushite rulers had to navigate a complex political landscape, balancing the demands of their Egyptian territories with those of their Nubian heartland. And while they were busy constructing pyramids and temples, they also had to fend off the ever-present threat of invasion from northern powers like the Romans and the Greeks. It was a bit like trying to build a sandcastle while someone keeps kicking at the foundations, a test of patience, skill, and sheer stubbornness. As we leave the bustling streets and towering pyramids of Merer, it's clear that the cultural and architectural achievements of the Kushites were more than just a footnote in history. They were a testament to the ingenuity, resilience, and creativity of a people who dared to dream big, even when the sands of time threatened to bury their legacy. The kingdom of Kush, with its tiny house pyramids and eclectic cultural mix, wasn't just keeping up with the Joneses. It was setting a trend that would echo through the ages. The story of the kingdom of Kush underlines a universal truth. History is not just written by the victors. It's sculpted by those who dare to innovate, adapt, and thrive in the face of adversity. And as we continue to unravel this saga, with its kaleidoscope of cultures and clash of empires, one thing is certain. The Kushites have plenty more surprises up their sleeves. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where the stakes get higher, the plots thicker, and the pyramids, well, they stay delightfully cozy and compact. As the sands of Kush continue to shift beneath the weight of history, the grand narrative of Nubian ambition faced its sternest test yet, with the Assyrian Empire breathing down their necks like an ancient world bouncer ready to evict the unruly partygoers. The Kushites found themselves in a precarious position by 656 BCE. The Assyrians, led by Ashurbanipal, a king whose name sounds like a sneeze but whose military prowess was no joke, were the new kids on the block, and they had their eyes on Egypt. The kingdom of Kush had been trying to hold on to Egypt like a toddler clinging to a favorite toy, but the Assyrians were less about sharing and more about takeovers. The Assyrian army was the equivalent of an ancient steamroller, flattening obstacles with efficiency and gusto. Their professional soldiers and state-of-the-art siege tactics were as terrifying as they were effective. When it came to warfare, the Assyrians were basically the apple of the ancient world, innovative, dominant, and with a penchant for setting trends no one else could quite keep up with. Amidst this looming threat, the internal situation in Kush was hardly a picture of tranquility. The leadership struggles that plagued the kingdom were akin to a particularly dramatic soap opera, complete with betrayal, intrigue, and the occasional coup. The constant jockeying for power among the Kushite elite created an environment more volatile than a middle school lunchroom. This internal instability only compounded the external pressures, as Kushite leaders struggled to present a united front against the Assyrian juggernaut. Economically, Kush was beginning to feel the pinch too. Maintaining control over Egypt was like trying to hold onto a bar of soap in the shower, slippery and often more trouble than it was worth. The costs of administration, combined with the need to fund military campaigns and maintain infrastructure, were draining the kingdom's resources faster than a leaky bucket. The lucrative trade routes that had once filled Kushite coffers were now under threat from Assyrian incursions, and the flow of gold, ivory, and precious stones began to dwindle to a trickle. By 656 BCE, the writing was on the wall, or the papyrus, if you will. The Kushites faced the harsh reality that their grip on Egypt was slipping, and no amount of royal pageantry or pyramid building could distract from the fact that they were outmatched both militarily and economically. It was time for a strategic retreat, a regrouping that would see them return to their Nubian heartland and focus on what they did best, metallurgy and trade. The decision to retreat from Egypt wasn't just a case of cutting losses. It was a calculated pivot to safeguard what remained of their empire. By pulling back to Nubia, the Kushites could concentrate on their strengths rather than getting bogged down in a costly and unwinnable war. It was the ancient equivalent of downsizing, focusing on quality over quantity and redirecting their energies towards innovation and sustainability. Back in Nubia, the city of Meroe became the focal point of this new golden age. The iron-rich soil around Meroe was perfect for smelting, and the Kushites turned this advantage into a thriving industry. Metalworking became the backbone of their economy, with iron tools and weapons becoming highly sought-after commodities. In the ancient game of rock, paper, scissors, metal was the Kushites' trump card, an asset that allowed them to maintain economic relevance despite the loss of Egyptian territories. Meroe didn't just become an industrial powerhouse, it flourished as a cultural hub too. Freed from the constant need to assert dominance over Egypt, the Kushites could indulge in a renaissance of sorts. Art, architecture, and religious practices flourished, blending Nubian traditions with the remnants of Egyptian influence. It was a time of introspection and innovation, where the focus shifted from empire building to cultural and economic enrichment. The retreat to Nubia and the subsequent golden age at Meroe highlight a crucial lesson in history. Sometimes, stepping back is the boldest move of all. The Kushites understood that while empires could rise and fall, the legacy of innovation and cultural richness was a treasure more enduring than any conquered territory. They realized that the true wealth of a civilization lay not in its borders, but in its ability to adapt, innovate, and thrive in the face of adversity. As the Kushites settled into their new reality, the echoes of their past glory continued to resonate. They left behind a legacy of resilience and creativity, a testament to a civilization that refused to be defined by its setbacks. The decline of Kush's control over Egypt was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one that would see them forge a unique identity and leave a lasting mark on history. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the saga of Kush, exploring the challenges and triumphs of a people who dared to dream beyond the shadow of the pyramids. The kingdom's journey is far from over, and the Nile's waters still have many more tales to tell. While the Kushites settled into their introspective era at Meroe, their legacy was quietly setting the stage for future African civilizations. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? The kingdom that once played a leading role in the drama of Egyptian power politics ended up being the quiet influencer, a bit like that friend who subtly introduces you to that band you end up loving. You see, Kush wasn't just a footnote in someone else's story. It was a pivotal chapter in the larger narrative of African history. As the Kushites thrived in their Nubian heartland, they were busy laying the groundwork for a cultural and economic renaissance that would ripple across the continent. Their mastery of ironworking, which had turned Meroe into an industrial powerhouse, spread its influence far and wide. It's a bit like how the steam engine revolutionized the industrial age in Britain. The iron tools and weapons crafted by the Kushites found their way into the hands of neighboring regions, sparking technological progress that would echo through the ages. This wasn't just about making sharper swords. It was about empowering communities, boosting agriculture with better tools, and crafting a future that was brighter and more prosperous. Now, let's talk about the Kushite role as a cultural bridge between Africa and the Mediterranean. Think of it as ancient globalization without the internet. The strategic location of Meroe along vital trade routes made it a bustling crossroads of culture and commerce. Caravans laden with gold, ivory, and other precious commodities traversed the deserts, connecting sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world. Kush was like the ancient world's version of a cultural ambassador, facilitating exchanges that would enrich civilizations on both ends of the trade routes. Imagine the bustling markets, the melange of languages, and the vibrant mix of goods from distant lands. It was a scene that would put any modern-day global market to shame. But let's not get too carried away with the romance of it all. For all the cultural exchange and economic prosperity, there were harsh realities to consider. The Kushites, like any empire, had to deal with the nitty-gritty of governance, resource management, and yes, the occasional brush with environmental challenges. The Nile, while a lifeline, was also unpredictable. Droughts could turn a flourishing trade hub into a parched ghost town faster than you could say climate change. The ability to adapt to these challenges was a testament to the resilience of the Kushites, but it wasn't always smooth sailing. As we reflect on the legacy of Kush, we must address modern misconceptions and romanticizations. The idea of Nubia as an exotic, mystical kingdom of pyramids and pharaohs is tantalizing, but it's only half the story. The true legacy of the kingdom of Kush lies not in the grandeur of its monuments, but in the enduring impact of its cultural and technological innovations. It's a legacy that defies the simplicity of romantic narratives, reminding us that history is often more complex than the myths we weave around it. In today's world, where the contributions of African civilizations are often overshadowed by Eurocentric narratives, the story of Kush serves as a poignant reminder of the continent's rich and diverse heritage. It challenges us to rethink our understanding of world history and to recognize the interconnectedness of ancient civilizations. Nubia was not just Egypt's shadow. It was a spotlight illuminating the vibrant tapestry of African history. As we wrap up this exploration of Kush, let's take a moment to appreciate the nuanced role it played in the grand narrative of history. The kingdom was both a shadow and a spotlight, a testament to the complexity of human civilization. It reminds us that history is not just a series of conquests and defeats, but a rich mosaic of cultural exchanges, technological progress, and human resilience. And while the pyramids of Merer may be smaller than those at Giza, their legacy looms large, a testament to a civilization that dared to carve its story into the sands of time. So, the next time you find yourself pondering the mysteries of ancient civilizations or marveling at the pyramids, remember the kingdom of Kush. Remember the black pharaohs who once ruled Egypt, the ironworkers who shaped a continent, and the traders who bridged worlds. Remember that history is as much about the shadows as it is about the spotlight, and that the legacy of Kush continues to enrich our understanding of the past. And with that, dear listener, may your dreams be as rich as Nubian gold and your curiosity as endless as the Nile. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop seeking the stories that shape our world. If you've ever felt overshadowed by more famous siblings, you might just relate to the Byzantine Empire. It's the Roman Empire's less glamorous but surprisingly influential little brother, living in the shadow of Rome's towering reputation but carving out its own significant legacy. Now, let's set the stage. It's the 4th century, and the Roman Empire is starting to feel the weight of its own vastness. We're talking about a stretch of land so expansive that it makes your last-minute road trip sound like a stroll to the corner store. Rome itself was bustling with over 1 million people at its peak, kind of like New York City, but with more togas and fewer Broadway shows. Enter Constantine the Great, a Roman emperor who was as ambitious as he was strategic. This guy wasn't content with just ruling over Rome. He had bigger fish to fry. By 330 AD, he had eyeballed a spot known as Byzantium, a city that would later be renamed Constantinople in his honor. Because why not name a city after yourself if you're an emperor? Byzantium was a modest little place on the Bosporus Strait, a location that screamed strategic importance louder than a town crier on market day. This strait was like the ancient world's Panama Canal, a shortcut between the Aegean and Black Seas, and a major trade route. For Constantine, it was the perfect place to set up shop and flex his imperial muscles. Now, why move the capital from the iconic city of Rome to this relatively obscure locale? Well, for starters, Rome was starting to feel a bit like a relic of its own past glories. The city was crowded, the infrastructure was creaking, and frankly, it was a bit of a logistical nightmare. Picture trying to coordinate an empire's affairs from a city that was centuries old and built for a different era entirely. Meanwhile, Byzantium was a blank slate, offering Constantine a fresh start and the chance to build a city fit for the new Roman Empire's future. But there's more to this than just logistics and a penchant for real estate. Constantine was also looking at the geopolitical map. Rome was situated in the west, while the empire's richer provinces were in the east. By moving the capital, Constantine positioned himself closer to the empire's economic heart. This was a savvy move, akin to a modern CEO relocating company headquarters to a tech hub to be closer to the action and innovation. Constantine's decision was not without its critics. Some Romans were less than thrilled about the new capital. It's a bit like if New Yorkers suddenly found out the capital was moving to Des Moines. They'd have questions. Yet Constantine saw the bigger picture. He envisioned a place that could stand against the external pressures facing the empire, particularly those pesky Germanic tribes and the ever-looming Persian threat. The strategic location of Constantinople meant it was easier to defend and maintain. Plus, it didn't hurt that the city was surrounded by water on 3 sides, making it a natural fortress. So, what did Constantine do to get his new capital up to snuff? First, he embarked on an ambitious building spree. We're talking about constructing massive defensive walls, which, fun fact, would stand the test of time until the city fell in 1453. He also ordered the construction of palaces, churches, and forums, transforming the city into a miniature Rome, complete with all the pomp and grandeur you'd expect from an emperor who wanted his name to echo through the ages. And echo it did. Constantinople would remain a hub of power for over 1,000 years. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, Constantine's conversion to Christianity. This guy wasn't just about bricks and mortar, he was also about faith. In 312 AD, he claimed to have seen a vision of a cross in the sky, which led him to convert to Christianity, and eventually to make it the empire's official religion. This was a seismic shift for an empire that had spent centuries worshipping a pantheon of gods. It was like announcing that the office was switching from PCs to Macs overnight, a bold move that would reshape the empire's cultural and spiritual landscape. With Constantinople established as the new capital, the Byzantine Empire was ready to step out of Rome's shadow and start forging its own identity. But it wasn't just about the new capital or the new religion. It was about a new way of operating. The Byzantines were masters of diplomacy and intrigue, often using cunning and negotiation to achieve their ends rather than relying solely on military might. This was an empire that knew how to play the long game, and it played it well. So there you have it. A strategic relocation, a religious transformation, and a new capital that would weather the storms of history for over a millennium. Constantine, the Great, may have seemed like just another ambitious ruler at first glance, but his decisions set the stage for an empire that would carry the torch of Rome long after the western half had crumbled. And if that isn't enough to earn a place at the family dinner table of history, I don't know what is. With the stage set for Byzantium to step out of Rome's shadow, it wasn't long before a new player took the scene, Justinian I. This guy wasn't content with a supporting role in the grand play of history. He wanted the spotlight, the accolades, and maybe even a standing ovation by the end. Justinian's reign starting in 527 AD was all about one thing, making Byzantium great again. Now, you might wonder what this entailed. Let's start with his ambitious military campaigns. Justinian was the kind of emperor who looked at the map and saw not just boundaries, but opportunities. He had his eye on lands that had slipped through Rome's fingers like sand through a sieve, areas like Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain. These territories had been scooped up by various Germanic tribes who were the medieval equivalent of real estate flippers. Justinian's mission was to take them back and restore some of that old Roman glory. Cue the dramatic music. Here's where our man Belisarius enters the picture. This general was Justinian's military rock star, a real-life action hero. Under his command, the Byzantine army embarked on a series of campaigns that were as daring as they were complex. Take the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, for instance. By 534 AD, Belisarius had toppled it with a force of just 15,000 men, a fraction of what you'd expect to need for such a feat. It was like winning the Super Bowl with a high school football team. Then there was the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy. This campaign wasn't a quick blitz. It dragged on for nearly 2 decades, from 535 to 554 AD. It was the kind of epic struggle that would have made Homer's head spin. The Byzantine forces had to deal with not just the Goths, but also a series of political shenanigans that would make Game of Thrones look like a board game of checkers. Despite these challenges, they managed to reclaim large swaths of the Italian peninsula. By the mid-6th century, Justinian's empire was looking a lot more like the Roman Empire of old, at least on the map. But there's more to Justinian's legacy than just military conquests. Enter Theodora, his wife and the empire's first lady of Fabulous. Theodora was no ordinary empress. She was born into the lower rungs of society, a former actress, a profession that back then was often synonymous with, let's say, adult entertainment. But if you think this background held her back, think again. Theodora was as politically savvy as they come. She was the kind of partner who didn't just support her husband's ambitions, she shaped them. Together, they were a power couple for the ages. Theodora's influence was felt in various reforms, particularly those advancing women's rights. She championed laws to protect women from forced prostitution and granted more rights to wives in divorce cases. In a world where women were often treated as mere extensions of their husbands, Theodora was a beacon of change. Sure, some would say she was scandalous, but isn't scandal often the seed of progress? Now, while Justinian and Theodora were busy reclaiming land and reforming laws, they also decided to embark on one of the most ambitious construction projects of their time, the Hagia Sophia. This wasn't just any church. It was meant to be the crowning jewel of Constantinople, a symbol of divine wisdom and imperial power. Constructed in just 5 years, from 532 to 537 AD, it was an architectural marvel, featuring a massive dome that seemed to float on air. The costs were astronomical, but for Justinian, no price was too high for eternal glory. However, not all was smooth sailing. Just as Justinian was reveling in his achievements, a disaster struck, the Plague of Justinian. Starting in 541 AD, this killer epidemic swept through the empire, claiming the lives of an estimated 25 million people, a staggering number in a world with a much smaller population than today. It was like the Black Death's less famous, but equally devastating cousin. The empire was hit hard, economically and socially, as the plague decimated the workforce and crippled the tax base. It was a grim reminder that even the most ambitious rulers are at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Yet, despite these setbacks, Justinian's reign is often remembered as a golden age. His efforts to reclaim lost territories, his monumental building projects, and his legal reforms, culminating in the Corpus Juris Civilis, a comprehensive codification of Roman law, laid the foundations for Byzantine society and influenced European legal systems for centuries. So, was Justinian a visionary or an overreacher? Well, like most historical figures, he was a bit of both. His reign was a roller coaster of triumphs and tribulations, with highs that touched the heavens and lows that plunged into despair. But one thing's for sure, he left an indelible mark on the Byzantine Empire, setting a standard for what it meant to rule with ambition and audacity. As for what comes next, stay tuned. The Byzantine story is far from over, and the empire, despite its challenges, still has plenty of twists and turns in store. Who knew history could be such a nail-biter? Now, onto the Byzantine economy, a subject that's as misunderstood as the plot of a Christopher Nolan film. Forget the image of an Emperor Scrooge McDucking into a vault of gold coins. The Byzantine economy was a web of trade routes and taxes, more like Wall Street with robes. Picture it, a bustling marketplace where East meets West, where spices, silks, and stories were exchanged with the same fervor as stocks on the New York Stock Exchange. Constantinople was the hub, the grand central station of medieval commerce, and its strategic location on the Bosporus Strait was the Wi-Fi hotspot of the ancient world. Let's start with the silk trade. Ah, silk, the fabric that whispered of luxury, power, and a serious fashion statement. Byzantium didn't just want to wear silk. It wanted to be the silk capital, the Paris of the medieval world. And for that, they needed the latest tech, silkworms. Here's the scoop. Around the year 552, 2 monks on a mission more covert than a James Bond film smuggled silkworm eggs out of China, hidden in bamboo canes. This clandestine operation was less Ocean's 11 and more mission, silk passable. The result? Byzantium broke China's monopoly on silk production faster than you can say cocoons. Suddenly, they were weaving wealth right in their own backyard, turning Constantinople into a silk superpower. Why all the fuss over silk? Well, in a world full of itchy wool and scratchy linen, silk was the Chanel no. 5 of fabrics, smooth, shiny, and screaming sophistication. It wasn't just about the look, it was about the bragging rights. To drape oneself in silk was to announce your status louder than a peacock at a pigeon convention. And for Byzantium, exporting silk to the West was like selling iPhones in a world of rotary phones. Charging. But the Byzantine economy wasn't just about shiny fabrics. It was a complex beast, fueled by trade and taxes. The government levied taxes with the precision of a Swiss clerk, and it wasn't just about squeezing peasants dry. Taxes funded the empire's defense, kept roads and aqueducts in working order, and paid for those grandiose building projects that emperors loved to brag about. And when taxes weren't enough, there was always the trusty coin minting, which brings us to Byzantine coinage, a numismatic tale as shiny and intricate as the coins themselves. Byzantine emperors minted coins like they were going out of style, which, funnily enough, they were. You see, coins weren't just currency. They were the ancient equivalent of a Facebook status update. Emperors stamped their faces and achievements on coins to spread their legacy far and wide. It was propaganda you could jingle in your pocket. The solidus, a gold coin introduced by Constantine, became the empire's economic backbone. Picture this, a coin so stable and trusted, it was the medieval equivalent of the US dollar. It was the currency of choice for international trade, proving that when it came to money, Byzantium meant business. But like any good story, it's a twist. Over the centuries, as the empire faced financial strain, the solidus got lighter and less pure, a bit like cutting corners with cheaper materials in a beloved recipe. That's the harsh reality behind the romantic image of Byzantine opulence. While the emperors flaunted their bling, the economy was a constant juggling act, balancing the demands of trade, military expenses, and internal stability. It was a world where the weight of a coin could tip the scales of power, and where economic decisions could make or break an emperor's legacy. But it wasn't all doom and debasement. The Byzantine economy was a marvel of resilience and adaptability, much like the empire itself. Even as external threats loomed and internal strife simmered, the Byzantines kept trading, taxing, and minting their way through the centuries. They were economic alchemists, turning the raw materials of the ancient world into a golden age of commerce. So, while the silk was fabulous and the coins were shiny, the real story of the Byzantine economy is one of complexity and cunning. It was a system that blended the finest threads of trade with the firm hand of taxation, spun together under the watchful eye of emperors who knew that commerce was as critical to their empire as any army. And as we unravel this tale of economic intrigue, remember, in Byzantium, wealth was woven as much from imagination and innovation as from gold and silk. Stay tuned, because there's more Byzantine brilliance yet to come. Ah, Byzantium, the ultimate empire of contrasts. Just when you think you've got them pegged as economic wizards, they turn around and prove they were also military innovators and religious trendsetters. Imagine this, a civilization that could throw down on the battlefield and then pivot to crafting religious doctrine that resonated across continents. It's the kind of multitasking that would make even the busiest Silicon Valley CEO sweat. Let's dive into the military muscle first. The Byzantines were renowned for their military strategies, which were as intricate as a Byzantine mosaic. But their secret weapon, Greek fire. This wasn't just your average campfire, folks. It was the flamethrower of the ancient world, an inferno that could burn on water, making it the ultimate tool in naval warfare. Introduced around the 7th century, it was like having the cheat codes to naval battles. Imagine the terror of seeing your fleet go up in flames with no extinguisher in sight. It was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, giving the Byzantines a fiery edge over their enemies. The recipe for Greek fire was a closely guarded secret, more secure than a grandma's apple pie recipe. Some say it involved a mix of sulfur, quicklime, and petroleum, but who really knows? The Byzantines weren't about to give away their trade secrets. This enigmatic concoction added to their mystique, making them the ancient world's equivalent of a tech company with a killer app. It was, quite literally, the hardest thing on the high seas. But the Byzantines didn't just stop at fire. They also excelled in fortifications. Those walls of Constantinople weren't just for show. They were an engineering marvel, standing strong against countless sieges. When the city finally fell in 1453, it wasn't because the walls failed. It was the advent of gunpowder cannons that finally breached them. Over a millennium, these defenses had repelled everyone from Avars to Arabs, proving that sometimes keeping invaders at bay is the best defense. Meanwhile, as Byzantium was setting fire to both enemies and imaginations, they were also busy with another kind of warfare, the spiritual kind. The Byzantine Empire was at the heart of Christianity, and they knew how to wield religious imagery like a maestro conducting an orchestra. Their religious iconography was the medieval equivalent of social media influence. Think of it as the Instagram of the ancient world, where a well-placed icon could sway hearts and minds. The veneration of icons became a central theme in Byzantine spirituality, with these images serving as conduits between the divine and the earthly. It was a visual language that spoke to the masses, much like a viral meme. But this wasn't without controversy. The iconoclastic controversy, a period of intense debate over the use of religious images, raged for over a century, starting in 726 AD. It was like a massive, empire-wide argument over whether those Instagram filters were really necessary. In the end, the iconophiles triumphed, ensuring that religious art continued to be a cornerstone of Byzantine and Orthodox culture. But while the Byzantines were busy perfecting their social media strategy in the form of icons, they were also dealing with a religious drama that would make any soap opera look tame. The Great Schism of 1054. This was the ultimate breakup between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, a split that was as much about politics and power as it was about theology. Picture two colossal institutions, each convinced of their own righteousness, finally reaching a point where they just couldn't see eye to eye anymore. The schism was a long time coming, rooted in centuries of tension between the eastern and western branches of Christianity. Language barriers, cultural differences, and disputes over papal authority all played their part. The final straw, the addition of the filioque clause in the Nicene Creed by the Western Church, which the East saw as an unauthorized amendment. Essentially, it was the ancient version of changing a group chat name without consulting the group, an unforgivable faux pas. In 1054, things reached a boiling point. Mutual excommunications were issued, and the two churches went their separate ways. It was a messy divorce, with both sides airing their grievances like a medieval airing of dirty laundry. The split left deep scars that are still visible today, underscoring how even the most sacred institutions are not immune to the complexities of human nature. So there you have it, a tale of fire and faith, of icons and schisms. The Byzantines were nothing if not multifaceted, wielding weapons both physical and spiritual to ensure their place in history. As we move forward in our Byzantine saga, keep in mind that this empire's legacy is as layered as the finest silk and as enduring as the walls of Constantinople. And with plenty of twists and turns still to come, you won't want to miss what happens next. Stay tuned, because Byzantium's story is far from over. And so, as the Byzantine Empire navigated its complex tapestry of military might and religious fervor, a new chapter loomed on the horizon, one that would unravel with all the drama of a season finale. Imagine an empire that had weathered the storm for over a millennium, only to face its most unexpected plot twist yet, the Fourth Crusade. Yes, that infamous misadventure of 1204 AD, when knights on a holy mission took a rather unholy detour and ended up sacking Constantinople instead of liberating Jerusalem. It's the medieval equivalent of a GPS malfunction, but with far graver consequences. To set the scene, let's backtrack a bit. By the late 12th century, the Byzantine Empire was no stranger to internal strife. Infighting among the nobility and a series of less-than-stellar emperors had left the empire wobbling like a top about to topple. Economically, things weren't much better. The treasury was emptier than a college student's fridge, and trade privileges granted to the Venetians had siphoned off valuable revenue streams. Add to this the external pressures from the Seljuk Turks and Normans, and you've got a recipe for disaster simmering away. Enter the Crusaders, who, by 1202, were gathering their forces for the Fourth Crusade. Funded in part by the Venetians, who were less interested in spiritual salvation and more in expanding their maritime empire, the Crusaders found themselves in debt to the merchants of Venice. And when you're in debt, sometimes you have to do favors. So, when the deposed Byzantine Prince Alexios Angelos promised the Crusaders a hefty payout in return for helping him reclaim the throne, it seemed like a win-win. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. In April 1204, the Crusaders breached the once impenetrable walls of Constantinople, not with cutting-edge technology or superior strategy, but with a hefty dose of opportunism and internal betrayal. The city that had stood as a bastion of Eastern Christianity was looted with a fervor that would make a Black Friday sale look tame. Priceless relics, gold and treasures were carted off, and the city was left in ruins. For the Byzantines, it was more than just a loss of wealth. It was a spiritual and cultural gut punch that left a scar as deep as the Bosporus itself. Yet, as with all great stories, it's not just about the fall, it's about what comes after. The Byzantine Empire was down but not out. Like a phoenix, or perhaps a slightly frazzled pigeon, it rose again, though diminished, with the establishment of the Empire of Nicaea. By 1261, Constantinople was retaken, but the empire was a shadow of its former self, a patchwork quilt of territories held together by sheer will and nostalgia for past glories. Now, let's talk innovation, or rather, the lack thereof. One of the most persistent myths about the Byzantine Empire is that it was a bastion of medieval stagnation. And sure, while the Byzantines were busy embroidering their robes, the Western world was having its own renaissance, inventing things like the printing press and new navigational tools. Meanwhile, the Byzantines stuck to their tried-and-true methods, like a company that refuses to upgrade from Windows 95. It wasn't that they lacked intelligence or creativity. It was that they were clinging to tradition in a world that was rapidly changing around them. As the 15th century rolled in, the Ottoman Empire was on the rise, a formidable force with a hunger for expansion. The Byzantines, hemmed in by a lack of resources and allies, were left vulnerable. It was like an aging rock star facing off against the latest chart-topping sensation. In 1453, the inevitable happened. Maimed Roman II, the Ottoman Sultan, laid siege to Constantinople. This time, the walls that had withstood so much finally gave way, not because they were poorly built, but because gunpowder and cannons were game-changers in medieval warfare. On May 29, 1453, Constantinople fell, signaling the end of the Byzantine Empire. It was the series finale that nobody wanted, but everyone saw coming. But before you despair, let's pause to ponder the Byzantine legacy. While the empire itself faded into history, its cultural echoes reverberated across time. Byzantine art, with its shimmering mosaics and ethereal icons, influenced the Renaissance and beyond. The Byzantine legal system, with its codification of Roman law, laid the groundwork for modern jurisprudence. And let's not forget the Orthodox Church, which continues to be a spiritual force for millions around the globe. In a way, the Byzantine Empire was like a character in a long-running series, sometimes heroic, sometimes flawed, but always compelling. Its story is a testament to the endurance of human ingenuity and the complex dance between tradition and change. So the next time you find yourself gazing at a Byzantine icon or admiring a piece of architecture inspired by its grandeur, remember, behind the glittering facade lies a history as rich and multifaceted as the empire itself. And as history has shown us time and again, even when the credits roll, the story never truly ends. On a breezy January day in 1755, or was it 1757, a baby boy was born on the island of Nevis. This boy, Alexander Hamilton, was destined to become one of the most influential figures in American history. The uncertainty of his birth year is just the first twist in the tale of a man who would later become the poster child for both genius and relentless ambition. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before he was a founding father, Hamilton was just a scrappy kid from the Caribbean with a penchant for making things happen. Now, Nevis wasn't exactly the epicenter of the colonial world. It was more like the sunburned cousin of the British Empire, known more for its sugar plantations than its social mobility. Yet, Hamilton's birthplace was a melting pot of cultures, and his mixed heritage, being born out of wedlock to a Scottish father, James Hamilton, and a French-descended mother, Rachel Fawcett, was just the beginning of his complex identity. His early life was anything but stable. His father abandoned the family when Alexander was about 10, leaving them in dire straits. And as if that wasn't enough drama, his mother died of a fever when he was around 13, leaving him and his brother orphans. Talk about a rough start. But here's where things get interesting. Hamilton had a brain that worked faster than a horse race at Churchill Downs. He was a voracious reader, devouring classics like Plutarch and Caesar as if they were the latest bestsellers. His knack for words got him a job as a clerk at a local trading company, Beekman and Kruger. Picture this: a teenage Hamilton dodging barrels of molasses and bales of tobacco while balancing the books and dreaming of a future beyond the horizon. It wasn't long before his talents caught the eye of community leaders, and by 1772, Hamilton was penning an account of a hurricane that had raised through the islands. The piece was so eloquent and vivid that locals were convinced the lad had the makings of a future leader. They pooled their resources to send him to the American colonies for formal education. Imagine that, a group of islanders believing in the potential of a young man so much they scraped together their savings to give him a shot at greatness. It's like the 18th century version of a GoFundMe campaign. Hamilton landed in New York City in 1773, just in time to witness the city bubbling with revolutionary fervor. By this point, he was around 16 or 18 years old. Again, the birth year mystery, and ready to make his mark. He enrolled in King's College, now known as Columbia University, where he quickly became a vocal advocate for American independence. During this time, he wrote pamphlets and articles that were so persuasive, some folks mistook them for the work of John Jay or even Samuel Adams. Not bad for a kid from Nevis, huh? But Alexander Hamilton wasn't content with just writing about the revolution. He wanted to be in the thick of it. In 1775, he joined a New York militia, and his leadership skills caught the attention of the one and only George Washington. By 1777, Hamilton had become Washington's aide-de-camp, a fancy title for the guy who handled the general's correspondence and strategic communications. It was an important role that put him at the heart of the revolutionary action, and he was just 20 years old. Hamilton's rise was meteoric, but let's not pretend everything was smooth sailing. For all his brilliance, he had a knack for making enemies faster than you can say Continental Congress. His ambition was palpable, and his sharp tongue often landed him in hot water. Yet, his ability to form strategic alliances was unmatched. He rubbed elbows with the likes of James Madison and John Laurens, forming bonds that would shape the future of the United States. The American Revolution was a hotbed of chaos, strategy, and the occasional comedic mishap. Hamilton was no stranger to this, especially when his fiery temperament clashed with military decorum. Once, during the siege of Yorktown in 1781, he famously led a charge against British redoubts with such ferocity that it was said he practically jumped over the parapet. Not exactly what you'd call subtle warfare tactics, but it worked. Hamilton's early years were a whirlwind of intellectual triumphs and personal challenges. He was a young man in a hurry, eager to carve out his place in the world. But beneath the romantic veneer of the self-made man lay a complex reality, a boy who had faced abandonment and adversity, who fought tooth and nail for every inch of ground he gained. As we follow Hamilton's journey, remember that every legend has an origin story, and his was as tumultuous as a Caribbean storm. Now, as we dive into Hamilton's role as George Washington's right-hand man during the Revolutionary War, let's be clear. This was not the cozy, romantic partnership you'd see in a buddy film. Imagine, instead, a high-stakes chess game where the pieces were muskets, and the Grandmaster was a guy with powdered hair and a penchant for crossing icy rivers. Hamilton's job was to manage Washington's correspondence and strategic communications, a task that required the patience of a saint, something Hamilton decidedly lacked. Our boy Alex was nothing if not ambitious. His role as aide-de-camp, starting in 1777, was more than just a glorified messenger gig. It put him at the center of Revolutionary War action, where he was privy to the plans, strategies, and occasional blunders of the Continental Army. Think of him as the 18th century version of a political strategist, only with more gunpowder and fewer sound bites. This position was a springboard for his military career, allowing him to soak up knowledge from the likes of Henry Knox and Nathanael Greene, two of Washington's top generals. But let's not romanticize it too much. Hamilton's job was riddled with logistical challenges that would make even the most seasoned project manager weep. Supplies were always scarce, with American troops often left with little more than a prayer and a half-empty cartridge box. Hamilton had to coordinate movements and supply lines over vast distances, often with nothing more reliable than the word of a courier who'd likely get distracted by a nice tavern en route. It's no wonder he was known for his impatience. Despite these hurdles, Hamilton had a knack for turning chaos into opportunity. His heroics at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781 are legendary. Leading a nighttime assault against British defenses, Hamilton and his men captured redoubts 9 and 10 in a matter of minutes. a feat that helped seal Cornwallis's fate and effectively ended major combat in the colonies. Sure, it was reckless, but sometimes you need a bit of madness to make history. Now, if Hamilton had a flair for the dramatic, he had a matching penchant for making his feelings known, loudly. He wasn't shy about expressing his frustration with the slow pace of promotions or the reluctance of Congress to pay the troops. And he often clashed with his colleagues, especially over matters of protocol and what he perceived as a lack of urgency. His letters to the Continental Congress were masterclasses in polite but pointed criticism, a skill that would serve him well in his later political battles. The American military wasn't just about battles and bayonets. It had its fair share of absurdities. Picture Hamilton, barely in his 20s, trying to enforce discipline among troops more interested in moonshine than musket drills. The army was a motley crew of farmers, shopkeepers, and anyone else who thought they could handle a rifle. Training these guys was akin to herding cats, but Hamilton managed to whip them into shape, more or less. Yet, for all his impatience and bravado, Hamilton understood the gravity of the situation. He wasn't fighting just for territory or glory, but for the very idea of a nation born from rebellion, a radical concept in a world dominated by monarchies. This vision fueled his drive and justified the sacrifices he demanded of himself and others. It's easy to see why he was so often at odds with the more cautious members of the military and Congress. Hamilton's time as aide-de-camp also honed his skills in diplomacy and negotiation. He saw firsthand the delicate dance required to maintain alliances, particularly with the French, who were as crucial to winning the war as gunpowder and grit. He learned to navigate the choppy waters of international politics, a skill that would later be indispensable when he found himself at the helm of the nation's finances. Amidst the chaos, one thing was clear. Hamilton was a man in a hurry. He didn't just want to fight in the war, he wanted to shape its outcome. His meteoric rise was fueled by a combination of intellect, audacity, and a willingness to take risks that others wouldn't dare. He saw opportunities where others saw obstacles, a trait that would define his career long after the war ended. In the end, Hamilton's transformation from aide-de-camp to a bona fide military leader was nothing short of remarkable. He may have been a young immigrant with a chip on his shoulder, but he was also a visionary who saw the future of America in bold strokes. And while his legendary impatience and penchant for drama sometimes rubbed people the wrong way, there's no denying that his contributions to the Revolutionary War were pivotal. But don't go thinking this is the end of his story. The war may have been winding down, but for Hamilton, the real battle was just beginning. With the ink barely dry on the Treaty of Paris, he was already looking ahead to the challenges of building a new nation from scratch. And if you thought the Revolutionary War was a wild ride, just wait until we dive into Hamilton's role in shaping the fledgling United States. Hold onto your tricorn hats, because this story is far from over. As the ink dried on the Treaty of Paris, Hamilton's ambitions were just getting warmed up. Think marathon runner huffing at the starting line. The Revolutionary War was the opening act. The main event was building a nation from scratch. Now, if you think that sounds like trying to assemble a complicated IKEA set without instructions, you're not far off. So, grab a cup of whatever keeps you awake, and let's dive into how Hamilton became the architect of an entire government's foundation. First things first, the Articles of Confederation. This was the U.S.'s first attempt at a national government, and let's just say it was about as sturdy as a house of cards in a wind tunnel. The Articles left the federal government weaker than a decaf espresso, with no power to tax or regulate interstate commerce. Enter Alexander Hamilton, who looked at this mess and thought, we can do better. He was ready to trade in the rickety Articles for something with a bit more horsepower. In 1787, Hamilton rocked up to the Philadelphia Convention, a gathering of the greatest minds, or at least the most opinionated ones, tasked with drafting the U.S. Constitution. Picture it, a room full of big egos, bigger ideas, and enough political maneuvering to make House of Cards look like a children's puppet show. Hamilton was all about a strong central government, a stance that was about as popular as a snowstorm in July among states fearing tyranny. This brings us to the Federalist Papers, the original political Twitter thread, only with more substance and fewer cat memes. Hamilton, along with James Madison and John Jay, penned a series of 85 articles under the pseudonym Publius, aiming to convince the public to ratify the new Constitution. Hamilton alone wrote 51 of these essays, cranking them out faster than you can say political manifesto. His writings laid the groundwork for a government that balanced liberty with order, a tricky tightrope walk if ever there was one. But let's not pretend it was all sunshine and parchment. Hamilton's vision clashed with Thomas Jefferson's, who was all about agrarianism and states' rights. While Jefferson envisioned a nation of yeoman farmers, Hamilton saw a future driven by industry and commerce. It was like watching a debate between an old-school vinyl enthusiast and a tech-savvy Spotify subscriber. These ideological showdowns weren't just verbal sparring matches. They were foundational to the American political landscape. The debates were fiery, with Hamilton's abrasive personality adding more fuel than a warehouse of kerosene. He was relentless, never one to soften his rhetoric to spare feelings. It's safe to say he didn't earn any Mr. Congeniality awards. Yet his energy was infectious, his arguments sharp and compelling. His push for a national bank and assumption of state debts was a masterclass in economic strategy, even if it made his opponents feel like they were trying to herd cats while wearing blindfolds. Now, let's bust a few myths about these founding fathers. They weren't demigods descended from Olympus, despite what some history books might imply. These guys were flawed human, and sometimes downright petty. The romanticized notion of a unified, harmonious group of visionaries is about as accurate as a weather forecast in hurricane season. They bickered, they schemed, and they definitely didn't always agree on the best path forward. Yet, it's precisely these heated debates and differing visions that gave birth to a dynamic political system. Hamilton's abrasive nature may have ruffled feathers, but it was precisely his unyielding drive that pushed the fledgling nation towards a centralized government capable of weathering the storms of the future. His economic policies laid the foundation for a robust financial system, which was crucial for a country drowning in post-war debt. Let's add a splash of economic context here, something Hamilton could do in his sleep. After the war, America's economy was about as stable as a two-legged stool. Hamilton's financial plan was a lifeline, aiming to establish public credit and encourage economic growth. He understood that a nation's strength was tied to its financial stability, a notion that still rings true today. His vision for a national bank and assumption of state debts helped cement the federal government's role in economic affairs, even if it did make him public enemy one in certain circles. And while we're on the topic of circles, Hamilton's social life was as vibrant as his political one was fractious. He hobnobbed with influential figures, leveraging these connections to further his goals. But let's not sugarcoat it. He also made his fair share of enemies. His blunt demeanor and penchant for confrontation often left him on the outs with political rivals and even some allies. In the end, Hamilton was a man who thrived on conflict and complexity, his personal and professional lives as intertwined as a pair of ivy vines. His ability to navigate the treacherous waters of early American politics was nothing short of remarkable. Yet, for all his brilliance, his relentless ambition and abrasive personality often left him standing alone, a visionary with the weight of a nation on his shoulders. As we wrap this up, remember that Hamilton's story is far from over. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry, and Hamilton was already eyeing the next challenge. He was a man of action, not content to rest on his laurels. The stage was set for further political drama, ideological clashes, and the relentless pursuit of a vision that would shape America for centuries to come. So, stay tuned, because this roller coaster is just getting started. As Hamilton eyed the next mountain to climb, he found himself staring straight at the Treasury. And boy, was it a mess. The national coffers were emptier than a college student's fridge, and the young United States was surrounded by creditors tapping their foot, waiting for their money. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the new Secretary of the Treasury, ready to turn America's financial chaos into a masterpiece of economic strategy, or at least something that wouldn't collapse overnight. Now, picture the scene. Congress hands Hamilton the financial equivalent of a flaming dumpster, and he responds with a plan so ambitious it might as well have come with its own soundtrack. In January 1790, Hamilton rolled out his report on the public credit. A document so dense it probably gave lawmakers paper cuts just flipping through it. His vision included federal assumption of state debts and the establishment of a national bank, a plan as daring as it was contentious. To say this proposal ruffled feathers would be like saying the Grand Canyon is a bit of a dip in the ground. Critics saw it as a power grab, a federal overreach that would trample states' rights like a herd of buffalo on a bender. But Hamilton was adamant. A strong central government was essential for financial stability. He wanted the federal government to assume $21, $5 million of state debts, a figure that, in today's dollars, will be the kind of money you'd expect to see in a billionaire's divorce settlement. Hamilton believed that by assuming the state's debts, the federal government could establish good credit and attract investments. It was a brilliant move, essentially turning creditors into stakeholders in the success of the new nation. But to get this idea off the ground, he needed support from a Congress that was about as divided as a family at Thanksgiving dinner. Enter the infamous dinner table bargain of 1790, where Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison hashed out a compromise. Hamilton got his debt plan, while Jefferson and Madison secured the future capital on the Potomac. It was a classic case of political horse trading, just without the horses. And then there was the National Bank. The Bank of the United States, Hamilton's brainchild and the bane of his political opponents. Established in 1791, it was designed to serve as a depository for federal funds and a creditor for the government. The bank would issue paper currency, stabilizing the economy like a much-needed shot of espresso. Critics, particularly Jefferson and his agrarian allies, were convinced it was a slippery slope toward tyranny, arguing that the Constitution didn't explicitly allow for such a bank. Hamilton, with his usual flair, argued that the Constitution provided implied powers necessary to fulfill its duties. The bank was a resounding success, providing the kind of financial stability that made investors weak in the knees. Yet, it also cemented Hamilton's reputation as a polarizing figure. He was viewed as both a financial genius and a political villain, depending on whether you were counting your coins or clutching your state's rights. But let's not forget the whiskey tax, which was Hamilton's attempt to raise revenue without squeezing the life out of the fledgling economy. In 1791, Congress passed a tax on distilled spirits, which seemed like a win-win. After all, Americans loved their whiskey almost as much as they loved bickering over politics. However, the tax hit small, backcountry distillers the hardest, sparking the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. Picture angry farmers with pitchforks and muskets marching against what they saw as an unfair tax, like a colonial version of a Yelp review gone wrong. Hamilton, never one to shy away from confrontation, urged President Washington to take a firm stance. The rebellion was quashed with a show of federal force, proving that the new government could enforce its laws. Yet, the incident left a sour aftertaste, highlighting the tension between federal authority and local autonomy. Hamilton's tax may have filled the treasury, but it also filled him with enemies, as his opponents painted him as an elitist out of touch with the common man. For all his triumphs, Hamilton's career was a high-wire act without a net. His financial policies were transformative, laying the groundwork for a thriving economy. But his relentless ambition and abrasive style often left him isolated. Even his allies found him exhausting, likening him to a hurricane in human form. Yet, it was precisely this intensity that drove his vision for America, a vision that was as much about financial stability as it was about national identity. Let's not sugarcoat Hamilton's fall from grace, though. His rivalry with Jeffersonian Republicans was the stuff of political legend, a clash of ideologies that was both personal and profound. Hamilton's affair with Maria Reynolds, exposed in 1797, was a scandal that tarnished his reputation, making him the first public figure to get wrapped up in a sex scandal in American politics. It was a tabloid tale involving blackmail, betrayal, and a pamphlet that ensured Hamilton's private life became very public. Despite the personal and political bruises, Hamilton's contributions were undeniable. He was a man who saw the potential for greatness in a nation still finding its footing. His economic strategies were the backbone of American financial policy, influencing generations long after his death. In the end, Hamilton's story is one of brilliance and blunders, of a man whose ambition was both his greatest asset and his Achilles heel. His legacy is a testament to the power of vision tempered by the perils of hubris. Even as he made enemies, he forged a path for a nation on the brink of greatness. And though his life ended in tragedy, his impact on the American political and economic landscape remains a towering testament to the complexities of leadership. As we leave Hamilton strategizing his next move, remember that his story is far from over. His life was a whirlwind of triumph and turmoil, a saga that set the stage for future battles both in his personal life and on the national stage. Stay tuned, because the tale of Alexander Hamilton is a roller coaster with more twists and turns than a mountain pass. As we leave Hamilton strategizing his next move, let's dive headfirst into the melodrama that was his later life, where personal and political fireworks collided with a bang loud enough to echo through history. The late 1790 and early 1800 saw Hamilton embroiled in a rivalry so intense it makes modern political feuds look like playground squabbles. At the heart of this tempest was Aaron Burr, a man whose name would forever be linked with Hamilton's in one of American history's most infamous duels. Hamilton and Burr were like oil and water, only if oil had a penchant for public finance and water was an opportunistic political chameleon. Burr was the vice president under Thomas Jefferson, a role that was about as fulfilling as being the spare tire in the political vehicle. Hamilton viewed Burr with suspicion, often describing him as someone who would seek to rise to power at the expense of principles. For Burr, Hamilton was a perpetual thorn in his side, a man whose sharp tongue and sharper pen had thwarted his ambitions more than once. The duel itself was the climax of years of animosity. Hamilton had helped Thomas Jefferson defeat Burr in the presidential election of 1800, lobbying fiercely against Burr in the House of Representatives. Burr was left holding the political equivalent of a consolation prize when he became vice president, a position that left him with little influence and a lot of resentment. Adding insult to injury, Hamilton later opposed Burr's bid for the governorship of New York in 1804, describing him as a man lacking moral compass, which, let's be honest, isn't the best endorsement for a guy running for office. The final straw came when a letter was published in the Albany Register, quoting Hamilton as saying he had a despicable opinion of Burr. Burr, seeing his honor trampled like a carpet beneath muddy boots, demanded satisfaction. And here's where things get delightfully absurd. Instead of taking the matter to a court of law, or, talking it out over a nice cup of tea, they decided to settle their differences with pistols at dawn, because nothing says civilized disagreement like a duel. Now, let's set the stage for this infamous showdown. Weehawken, New Jersey, July 11, 1804. The location was already a notorious dueling ground, probably because New York had inconveniently banned the practice. It was a misty morning, the kind that makes you question your life choices, and Hamilton and Burr faced off at 10 paces. Hamilton, always the strategist, intended to throw away his shot, aiming wide to indicate he didn't really want to kill Burr. Burr, on the other hand, took aim and fired, hitting Hamilton in the abdomen. Hamilton fell, mortally wounded, and was carried back to New York City, where he died the next day. The duel was a public relations disaster for Burr, leaving his political career deader than Hamilton himself. It was the 19th century equivalent of a viral scandal, with newspapers across the young nation denouncing Burr as a murderer. He was charged with murder in both New York and New Jersey, though neither charge stuck. Burr's reputation, however, was beyond redemption. He fled to the South to escape prosecution and faded into the kind of political obscurity that makes Where Are They Now? Segments look lively. Hamilton's death was mourned by many, but it also had the peculiar effect of cementing his legacy. In death, Hamilton became a martyr for the cause of federalism, a man whose vision for America was as ambitious as it was enduring. The duel has been romanticized in popular culture, celebrated as a tragic clash of titans, yet the reality was a bitter, unnecessary end. It's a reminder that even the greatest minds can be brought low by pride and poor judgment. Now, let's take a step back and reassess Hamilton's impact. The man was a whirlwind of intellect and ambition, a visionary who saw the United States not as a collection of states, but as a unified nation poised for greatness. His financial policies laid the groundwork for modern capitalism, setting America on a path of economic prosperity. He understood the importance of a strong central government, a notion that was revolutionary in a world dominated by monarchies. Yet, Hamilton was not without his flaws. His arrogance and inability to play the political long game often left him isolated. He was a man of contradictions, driven by ideals yet undone by personal vendettas. His affair with Maria Reynolds and the subsequent scandal exposed his vulnerabilities and tarnished his reputation, a reminder that even the most brilliant among us are all too human. In the end, Hamilton's legacy is one of complexity and contradiction, a testament to the enduring power of vision tempered by the pitfalls of ambition. He was a man who dared to dream big, who saw a future for America that was as expansive as it was inclusive. His contributions to the founding of the nation are undeniable, a testament to the power of intellect and the perils of hubris. Hamilton's story, with all its triumphs and tragedies, is a reminder that history is not just a series of events, but a tapestry woven with the ambitions, failings, and achievements of those who came before us. So, as we wrap up this roller coaster ride through Hamilton's life, let's leave with a sharp observation. In the grand tapestry of American history, Hamilton's thread is one of brilliance, audacity, and an indomitable spirit that continues to inspire. His life may have ended in tragedy, but his legacy is a testament to the transformative power of vision and the enduring impact of those who dare to dream.